Hello and welcome to Developmental Psychology, to exploring the lifespan and to really trying to get into this idea of how does age and how does the development we go throughout our lives kind of manifest in changes in the physical body and in our emotional experiences and in our relationships and in our spirituality and in our psychology. And if we look at evolution as meaning how things change over sequences of lifetimes or generations of lifetimes, we're looking at development as within that one single lifetime, within your life, how you change and everything that means. And what does change mean? What does your lifetime mean? And what do we really learn from developmental psychology that can help us understand the human condition? Welcome to the course. I'm glad you're here. Grab a pen and a piece of paper, and if you might have to get used to my bald head and long rants, but I love you. I hope you feel welcome, and let's get into this. Cheers. So since we're not in person, obviously, I just wanted to spend a second to just tell you a little bit about myself, and well, more so just to show you my family. This is the bottom middle picture is me and my wife Julie, and then our oldest, who's now 5 and who's at school right now in senior kindergarten. She's in the cool side. She says she's in senior kindergarten, not junior anymore. 5 years old. Yep. And then little Charlotte's just 6 weeks old. Right. So I got 2 daughters, and they take up most of my time, and they fill it with meaning and work and stuff. But yeah, it's we live in Kitchener, kind of near Conestoga College, where I work. And if you're familiar with Kitchener, I actually live really close to the Kitchener Auditorium where the Kitchener Rangers hockey team plays. That's a picture of my daughter at the top there of her at Sauple Beach, which is one of our favorite places to go to vacation. I love that a lot of you are up in, I know some of you aren't, you're spread kind of around Ontario, but a bunch of you are up in the North Bay area, and I'd love to come visit Nipissing campus sometime. I've still never been there, but I have a great love of the North. My family, we go to Algonquin. Sometimes we go up to the Parry Sound, Hanover area a lot. We've been out east several times. So this is me. This is my family. All right, let's get to the course. I just wanted to kind of take a second and just show you that, just to personalize it a bit or whatever. We're human beings. I'm a teacher from Kitchener. Your students from all around Ontario. We're all going through this intense stage, I guess, socially or whatever, with everything that's been happening. And I hope you can use this course as a chance to just kind of, hopefully we can just talk about some interesting things and help explore some of these ideas that underlie this whole kind of major branch of psychology research.
Hi.
What's your name?
Evelyn.
How old are you now?
5.
You're going off camera. Okay, I'll come back this way. Say, have a good day.
Have a good day.
And good luck at school.
Good luck at school.
Show them what your friend gave you today. It's in your hand. Oh, beautiful. Okay, say bye.
Bye.
Point number 1. I'm just going to kill the camera a little bit so you can see that full image of the developing brainstem into the full brain. We develop the same way but differently. And that's a weird comment to start the course with, but I think if you can kind of let your mind relax and just think about that without seeing and being overwhelmed by the apparent contradiction there, and realize it's kind of just a way of saying that there's way more ways that we're the same. Even if you take something really complex developmentally like puberty or something like that, there's absolute similarities between people, but the expression and the way it plays out and affects your life and the kind of individual idiosyncrasies of how it played out for you is so specific. And this is going to be kind of a theme we come back to at different points in this course. Is interesting how in psychology we're both similar and different. And that's one of the most interesting things about psychology. We have similar hardware. And whether we call the hardware the brain and kind of our personality and our mind as a verb is kind of software. But this idea that we seem to be so different than each other, but in so many ways we're like biochemically the same. So what's creating these differences, and how do these differences develop? That's basically developmental psychology. Okay, so after conception, so we're looking at this idea of approximately 250,000 new nerve cells per minute. By 4 weeks, the brain starts to emerge. We start to see neurons taking on specialized tasks. So remember, a neuron is, add to your note, a neuron is a nerve cell in the brain. Sometimes in pop culture, they're just called like brain cells or whatever, but the more correct word is a neuron. Because it's, well, not to jump into this in the first slide, but there's this complicated connection between the nervous system and what we call the brain. But that by week 4, we start to see neurons taking on specialized tasks, which is so fascinating that by 4 weeks old, there's already neuron cells in the brain doing specific things, right? Which by the time the baby's born is going to be the full working newborn brain. Before birth, the genes mainly direct brain development. Okay, so this is saying like we're going to be looking at in this course a lot around the ideas of nature, nurture, and topics that you've probably heard that idea before, but it's actually something that's hard to get away from in psychology courses, like how much of a thing is explainable by what we would call nature or genetics or inborn characteristics or heredity, and how much of the situation is being controlled by things like learning and the environment and the social pressures. But before birth, it's basically genes that are directing the child's brain development. Now, you could definitely make the argument that there's indirect environmental influences on the baby through mom. So if something's influencing mom, like say, for example, super high levels of stress or sleep deprivation, would be 2 good examples that we could maybe see like effects. Now, by the time the baby's born, there's upwards of 1 billion cells created by the time of birth, and we're going to get in. I would say write these down and just kind of be in the habit of, as we're going through these videos, taking notes and stuff, but I'm not the type of teacher that's going to be too super focused on that kind of real hard, straight memorization stuff. I want you to kind of get the overall picture here, though, that we're going to talk in this course about mitosis and meiosis and how cells divide and stuff like that next time when we talk about biological beginnings. But the thing that's so complex is that by the time the baby's born with a complex brain, the newborn brain, and then it meets the world. Okay, so if you're taking written notes here, I'd title this something like 5 main points from developmental psychology, or from the study of human development. Again, sometimes if I say like lifespan, you might want to add this to in your notes somewhere near the beginning, that if I say like lifespan development or human development or developmental psychology, those are all very, I don't know, in my mind they're almost interchangeable words. There's aspects of human development though that aren't, I guess, like technically that's, there's aspects of human development like say the physical aspects, but then again it's like at a certain point separating the physical and the emotional is just theoretical. It's about you, and it's about how you and me develop throughout life, and it's lifelong, meaning that the majority of the early researchers in the field of developmental psychology, like to use example, some of the greats like Freud and his daughter Anna, were really focused on child development, and basically up until 18, and then it's basically like you had an adult brain that you then carried with you for the rest of your life. And it was really one of Freud's most famous students. Not his most famous student, who would probably be Carl Jung or his daughter Anna, but the great Erik Erikson, who you've probably heard of in some of your classes, in his stages of psychosocial development. And what was his basic idea? Well, first of all, that you're born into a world that, and you have all these Freudian drives, like Freud was saying. I'm getting huge off topic, but I'll pull this back together. And Erickson said, but then you're also heavily influenced by these demands from your culture, and so it's almost, he's basically making a nature-nurture argument. And he's saying that development is actually lifelong. We have to look at the fact, and you all sort of already know that, like obviously being 25 and 75 is a very different life situation. What you care about is different. What's the significant pieces in your social world is different. What you're afraid of or excited by is completely different, potentially. Okay, so number one, that this idea of development is being lifelong. That, and I kind of already hit this, but that it's multidimensional, right? And that's just a big word. You know what multidimensional means. I don't need to break down that word, but dimensional is actually a key word, because dimensional means it's the difference between, it's part of it's just language, but part of it is actually kind of clarifying, because it's different than just saying there's multiple parts. It's saying that they're dimensional parts, meaning they actually exist in the same place, just in different dimensions. But if there's a different dimension on this planet, it would still exist on this planet. It's different, getting in a little bit almost into quantum physics, but just what a dimension is, it means that you are your biology and your cognitive system and your social system and your spirituality and your physical biochemistry. Biology, I guess I already said that, all at the same time. It's just a theoretical distinction at a certain point, right? We tend to think of our thoughts and our emotions as different. The majority of your emotions are biochemical reactions in your brain. Now, a lot of our emotions are actually there's a lot of very interesting current research on gut bacteria. And it's interesting that our ancestors all talked about gut instincts and feeling it and stuff in their gut. Your body has a system of intelligence linked through the nervous system. So the point I'm trying to make here is just this idea of understanding how a human being develops from a baby to an adult and into old age demands engagement with these kind of complicated factors like biology, sociology, understanding cognition, understanding evolution, understanding human society, like anthropology stuff. Development for a human is plastic. Now, if you think of plastic, like this pen case is plastic, like there's aspects of this microphone that are plastic, you know, the mouse here has some probably pretty some stylized plastic or whatever. It's like plastic is almost everything in your room that you're looking at that's not wood or steel. And it's like that word means, and why plastic was such a game changer on the world scene. It's malleable, it's shapeable. So saying that development is plastic means that it's kind of this belief that if there were issues in the past that people struggled with, whether we're talking about in like a trauma abusive situation or whether we're talking even about like academically with like learning and disability or something, that there can be, well, that people have a capacity to change and to get stronger or establish new patterns or whatever the specific example we're talking about. And then to understand that, we need to understand this next point, that development is contextual. That we don't develop, and we'll get into this a lot with the research of people like Vygotsky, one of the most famous Russian psychologists besides Pavlov. And this idea that like your family and your schools and your peer groups and the neighbors and your Zoom class and all this stuff, that all these things are having influences on you and creating a situation that's maybe different than the person living beside you, and that we all have our own kind of developmental context situation. What's the setting of the movie of your life? That has a factor, and that when we're in this last point, that when we're talking about development, we're actually talking about a bunch of things. We're talking about not just this idea of like 0 to 100, and it's not always like a linear like 1 plus 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 plus. So let's, for example, here talk about something like lung capacity or like physical strength, which is pretty small at the beginning, and then all of a sudden around 2 we see like almost a doubling of the cardiovascular system, which is why I'll get to this later too, but this is why like we call it terrible twos, and mainly just because they have this massive increase in energy and movement ability. So they're getting into things all the time like they weren't just a little bit a while ago, but it's a little bit easier to understand when you realize that it's basically like if I just immediately turned you into a super athlete. It's like a complete doubling of the cardiovascular system, the biggest jump that you'll experience in your entire life. So that'd be an example of growth. But then say if we're looking at that same cardiovascular system in 50-year-olds and we're looking at lifestyle practices that can help maintain functioning cardiovascular systems in this example, and then maybe we're looking at later in life and how to regulate loss, right? So how to not just get better or maintain, but how to do things to fight against the natural tendency to lose some of these things, or maybe not the natural tendency, but the tendency. So these 5 things are kind of core underlying ideas in developmental psychology. It's lifelong, multidimensional, plastic, contextual, and it involves this idea of growth regulation and maintenance. Here's a quick special guest appearance by the one and only Charlotte, who just woke up and wants to say hi. Say hello to the camera. You look like you just saw a ghost. Alright, cheers. Back to the presentation in just a sec. So throughout this course, we're going to be looking at these kind of 3 main areas of developmental processes. So the biological. So this is going to be when we're looking at changes in our physical nature. So the most sort of straightforward example of that would be something like puberty, or even the brain development early in the infant. So we'll be looking at this and how it results from things like genes and brain development, nutrition, exercise, hormones, all those things that are kind of the biophysical factors that are affecting your development. So I want to keep, as we go through this course, stressing this idea of what we're really interested in is this kind of dynamic interplay between these things. Who you're becoming as a person, who this child's becoming is this interaction between biological, cognitive, and social emotional processes. So social emotional referring to changes in behavior with other people, changes in development of emotions, changes in development of personality. Right? My 5-year-old Evie has quite a personality now, but when she's 20, her personality will be similar, but very different in all kinds of ways. And it's interesting to see what we mean by that. What we mean, we say like a 5-year-old and a 25-year-old and a 55-year-old all have personality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it manifests in their experience in the same way and in the same role. Yeah, personality is a really interesting one because we use that word all the time, but it's actually kind of hard to pin down. What do we actually mean to say that we're a different person than someone else, and that our personhood actually has almost a style to it, and almost so much so that you could say that my personality style is different or like someone else. Right? And what would a personality style even be? Just my patterns of responding to situations, my emotional responses, my lived relationships. So we'll get into all these things that when we're talking about development, we're really talking about how some of the things on the screen here, I skip cognitive. So like things like how we develop intelligence and how we develop the ability to use language. Right, in a certain sense, you're sitting there looking at a screen that's a pre-recording of me talking and making vibrational sounds in my voice, and those vibrations in my throat that are going through my microphone, traveling all the way to your house, going into your ears, turning it from a vibrational input into a biochemical signal that a different part of your brain is adding meaning to in the moment, so that you're understanding the words that I'm saying in real time. Yeah, language, the ability to hear language in a meaningful way. Right, so you probably, if you were like not really listening when your parents were trying to tell you something when you were little, you probably heard someone say like, "Oh, there's a difference between hearing and listening," and it's like, well, one of them is referring to the sense experience, right? Hearing is that you've actually been exposed to a sound, and it's almost like listening is this. You could have heard something but not been listening, not adding the cognitive meaning. Yeah, so we'll spend quite a bit of time in this course talking about language development too, because that's so key, and it's like such a, well, at this point still, except for maybe killer whales, a fairly uniquely human thing, and one of our greatest skills as a species. I hope you like this class. I'm going to kind of teach traditional developmental psychology, but my interest and my ability to add is sort of in the areas of biology and developmental development, but also evolution, and sort of how that all fits into some sort of broader aspects of Western science and philosophy, and just how these fields emerged over the last few hundred years. And if we're talking about psych specifically, we're talking about like the last 130 years or so. Right, Freud wrote Interpretation of Dreams, or published, I should say, in 1899, so that's like what, not even 130 years ago. And that was really the birth of psychology as a discipline. So, well, some would say, some would argue that, and I think some people, if you ask I think I might have already said this to you, but some people would argue over the founder of psychology. Some people saying Freud, and some people saying William James, the American philosopher. And I think it's just a matter of perspective. I think it's safe to say that the founder of American psychology is William James, and the founder of psychology broadly, or European psychology, is Freud. Okay, that was unrelated to this slide, but just a weird rant. Okay, next slide. So next I'm going to do is just kind of a quick overview of these 7 main defined periods of human development, and just these, like, today's presentation is just going to be a little bit of an overview of what we're going to do in this course. So as we move through this course, then we're going to highlight each kind of stage, whether we're talking about infancy or early childhood or middle childhood or late childhood in the teen years, and we're going to look at how these ideas are then applied and relevant for that age group. Okay, so I'm going to just give you a quick overview of these 7 different types, or periods, I mean. Okay, so I'll just put up the points I want you to have there. So the first stage is the prenatal stage, right? So like before the baby's born, when the baby's in the womb, and from conception to the time of birth, we see tremendous growth in the brain. And from a developmental psychology perspective, this is a very interesting time in brain development. This is when a lot is happening, especially cognitively, in terms of building who you are. And we're going to look at this idea of how over this period of approximately 9 months, a human being goes from a single cell to you. And that's one of the most interesting things about humans. And I can certainly talk to that just from the perspective of having had a kid just like a month and a half ago, and my wife having Charlotte, and just being there for it, and also with Evelyn 5 years ago, and just how overwhelmingly human that experience is, and just how powerful of an experience it is. Okay, so, but again, I kind of got on my own little personal rant there, but in this course, we're really going to be looking at cognitive development and brain development during that period, right? Where we know about this early development of the lungs and the heart and the central nervous system and the peripheral, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system and the brain stem. Again, don't ever worry about writing down all my random rants. I'll try to kind of focus on what's on the screen. A lot of the information for like tests and stuff will be from, it won't be from something I say in some super random rant. Okay, so my hope is that you enjoy this course and these videos aren't too bad, and you're kind of like writing down stuff and like just kind of hanging with me when I do a bit of a rant. But I'm trying to do my rants with the intention of adding a bit of context and situation to it. Oh, there goes the phone. Good time to switch slides. Catch you on the next slide. So the next stage that we're going to look at in the life cycle is the infancy stage, and this is sort of, we'll talk a little bit about newborn, the first few weeks and stuff, and then basically it's all the way, I should put this up so you can add it to your notes. the major period is sort of from birth to about roughly 2 years, right? So depending on what researcher you're looking into, I don't need these anymore. Sorry, I should have took those off before. I was just checking how the last few slides sounded. So from between 0 and 2 years old is kind of this infancy period, right? Before we get into what we would kind of consider childhood. And you sort of see this when you have kids, like once the kid gets over 2, and you'll start to see that they just don't behave like a little baby anymore. They start to behave like what you would kind of just commonly call a kid. And I can remember even making comments like that to my wife, like with my daughter that's now 5, when she was sort of a little bit past the stage of being like, it's weird how Evelyn's kind of like a kid now. And I know that sounds weird, but when it's your baby, it's weird to see them start to become their own person. So that's kind of what's about to happen in the next stage. At this time, from birth until 18 months, which is a year and a half, or the full 2 years. And that's just to kind of respect the fact that there's so much difference in how humans experience life. And so for a lot of these things, it's like kind of generally sound. And then, so for example, most people will fall between that 18 and 24 range, have similarities around things like coordination, language, symbolic thought. So you're starting to, by the end of the stage, hear some first words. The baby's starting to be able to get close to an idea later we're going to call object permanence, or the idea is that things exist even when they're not there, which is behind the game peekaboo. And then coordination, right? You're starting to see a lot more movement, maybe even fully walking, or at least like starting to crawl or scoot along on their butt. And you're starting to really start to see that kind of motor skill development. So again, keep in mind, today I'm just sort of touching on each of these stages, and then as we get into the course, we're going to go kind of heavy on each of these and really look at the whole complexity of variables, or developmental variables, around the stage. I'll stop saying this, but I hope you enjoy this class. I don't know, I hope it's a cool class. I hope it's a class, or not necessarily cool, but just something that, you don't dread watching. And I'll try to make these videos decent. You can tell the clock in the background gives away the fact that I'm going to be doing these sort of at scheduled times. I did some of the first like 10 slides or whatever of this in the morning. And then now it's like almost midnight, but night school. All right, next slide. So at this stage, there's a lot of stuff going on in the brain, right? This is probably the only thing that's kind of close to it is the physical changes happen in puberty. This is definitely when we're seeing the brain in its most cognitively charged stage, right from conception to about the end of infancy. This new brain is being built. This new mind is forming. Right, especially if we view the brain sort of as the hardware, and the mind as a verb. The mind is what the brain does. So then as we get older, and this is going to be, I kind of mentioned this earlier, that early on in the history of developmental psychology, it was concerned very much with just the kind of birth to 18, and a lot of the time, even in a modern developmental psychology course, is focused on these early years. And that's just, for some reason, Darwin jumped into my head there. We'll talk about him later, but Darwin, who you've definitely heard of probably for his ideas around natural selection and survival of the fittest, and the whole kind of broader theory of evolution. A lot of people don't know that he was also heavily interested in child development. And it shouldn't be that surprising, because I've made this point earlier, but that it's important to say a bunch of times, developmental psychology and evolutionary psychology are sort of two sides of the same coin. Evolutionary psychology, developmental psychology is trying to explain what we see. Like, we see that kids tend to start talking about roughly the same age. They tend to start walking at roughly the same age. If you're asking why is that the case, the reasons for that will reach far back into our evolutionary past as humans, and would be kind of the realm of evolutionary psychology. So it's kind of like when we're looking at human patterns. Developmental psychology is looking at what we're seeing now. If we were to snapshot look at people, and if we took 1 million kids and this is like literally how they would have originally started to form norms. So it'd be like, well, let's like literally test with thousands and thousands of kids and see when they start talking and see when they start to walk, and then divide it by the amount of people in the study and start to get averages, right? And that those averages then became really important in psychology, developmental psychology, for a long time. And then you'd have moms and parents really concerned that their kid isn't meeting the norms and they're starting to talk too late. And we've kind of, as a developmental psychology field, learned over time that most kids catch up, and that you can definitely worry too much about things like norms. But back to the slide. I'm not sure why I was talking about that. So early in this childhood section, we're going to talk about both early and then kind of late childhood. And we're going to look at it both from the perspective of physical development and then also with this kind of social and emotional component. Okay, so as we get from like 2 to 11, and I know that's a massive age range, but we're going to break it down into smaller components. And we're going to look at how the child's starting to get more self-sufficient, so able to do things for themselves, more able to self-care. They're starting to get school readiness skills, social skills. I'll share some stories at that point about my oldest, because she's super keen for school. She's really hoping she gets math homework, and I'm like, oh, once you start getting math homework, you might regret that wish. But she's in senior kindergarten now, so she's like she made a new friend, Annika, today, so she's like super happy. Then middle and late childhood, we'll start talking about some of the development of these early academic skills and reading, writing, arithmetic that are kind of core to, the academic world. And then this idea that socially what's happening at that time is obviously the child's at school and they're starting to be exposed to a world outside of the family. So it's really interesting in developmental psychology from this perspective that like the early part of the child's life, the social world is almost entirely family based, and even more so almost primarily mom or primary caregiver. And then there's this drastic change to the social world. Maybe the biggest change to your social world that you ever experienced was actually going from home and not being in school to being in school. And now all of a sudden there's this emergence of the peer group. And that's going to be kind of what we talk about that week. So for adolescents, what I'll try to do with these slides is I'll throw up the whole slide just so that you can kind of write at your own speed, and then I'll just talk for a bit. And we're going to look a lot at the brain in this whole course. Obviously, you're like, yeah, no kidding, it's a psychology course. But yeah, it's weird kind of laughing at my own joke or whatever, but it's like I am trying to picture like I'm talking to you live and like you're sitting here listening, or like I don't know, I gotta stop talking about the process and just record my points. Adolescence is one of the trickiest because we're not kids, we're not adults, we're in this in-between adolescent stage, which is literally what that word means. We're experiencing incredible changes physically, right? Puberty. We're also in high school, a time when we're the most susceptible to people's opinions of us and to peer pressure, and which is both positive and negative. That's a thing we'll talk about later. A lot of peer pressure is actually, working out with your friend or doing something positive with your friend, like that's all peer pressure towards positive behavior. But we see this situation where you're going through all these physical changes, you're in this social setting that's as overwhelming as any social setting you'll ever be in the rest of your life. High school is going to be where you have the most amount of time around people your age, where you're all figuring out who you are. You're all maybe like the bottom point there, increased risk taking. You're all trying to be independent. You're all trying to figure out your identity. And this is where we're going to get into Erikson and this idea of like, I'm not like you, like me too. It's like being a teenager was about, in Erikson's idea, and we'll get to his model later, it was all about trying to kind of figure out who you are and how you fit into this complicated world. Now imagine how hard it is for teenagers nowadays with like COVID and lockdown and being not able to, I really do have a lot of empathy for people in different age groups. You could almost look at like, so one of you, if there's someone looking for a potential future thesis topic, that would be amazing. If you looked at how COVID lockdowns had different developmental impacts on people depending on their, whatever we called this, like these different periods of development, right? How it affected infants in the first 2 years of life, right? Like maybe I should get too personal, but with like my daughter, I'm making sure people hold her and stuff like that. I'm trying to make her have as normal of a childhood as possible. And then you could look at like, just move up to my other kid and look at like Evie, like she's never been at school without masks. That's, to her, it's almost just normal, and well, there's problems associated with that too. So when the emergency response becomes the normal, right, it's probably been uniquely challenging for the age range of a lot of you, especially around things like dating and social life and going to university and then having it all on your computer. And then I'm sure if we were having this conversation live, there'd be things people would have to say about this. And it's like, I'm not even trying to get into the nonsense of the politics around any of it. I'm just trying to say, like, to claim that all of this had no developmental impact would be illogical. And speaking of illogical, how do I segue back? As a teenager, we see the development of more logical thought, right? So more ability to use reason and to actually deduce and say like, well, okay, well, these things don't make sense because of this, and have more kind of a complicated and nuanced understanding of the world. But at the same time, it's teenage thinking tends to be more abstract and idealistic and utopian. And that's not because that's actually a natural, almost predictable aspect of human thought development. And if you say, well, why do teenagers tend to be more idealistic and utopian in their thinking? And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that there's actually evolutionary reasons for that, that for the tribe to survive, the teenage kind of aged young people oftentimes would extend beyond the tribe. And it makes almost sense that it's kind of interesting to think that that's when a lot of the risk taking is at its highest, and that, once we get to like 24 or so, we tend to see a huge decrease in risk taking behaviors, and that's even amplified more if people have children. More time spent outside the family. So there's this huge social change that happens during the teenage years. And I know that I don't really have to tell you that from just a social perspective. You obviously know. And some of you, like, I just turned 40. Some of you might be 20 or 22 or something, and like fairly recently in the adolescent stage. And we're going to talk in this course too how oftentimes you'll hear people kind of technically teenagers or 13 to 19. But we're going to talk in this course about how there's this idea from a guy named Dr. I think his first name is Jason Arnott, and he talks about this idea of like emerging adulthood, and that it might be more accurate to view adolescence as almost stretching into the early 20s, or like he uses the term emerging adulthood to mean there might be like an in-between period even between adolescence and adulthood. And a bunch of you are probably in that stage where it's like you're in school longer than your ancestors would have been, for sure. The majority of all of our ancestors wouldn't have had post-secondary education, especially if we go back more than a couple hundred years. People are having kids later, staying home longer. So it kind of creates this emerging adulthood category of our demographics. All right, let's keep going here, because I'm just going to try to touch on all these, and I say that after this current slide, I can see I've been on for 7 minutes, so maybe you guys are like, okay, we get it, teenager. Okay, next slide here. So I'm going to keep going here and talk about these remaining stages, but I also wanted to highlight the fact that in our current course, so this is CHSF 2106, and in this course we're going to be doing basically 0, like from birth through conception, so actually right from conception to roughly the end of the teenage period. Right, and then I have additional stuff I'm going to be adding into the course, but timeline-wise, we're sort of doing that. And then a lot of you will also be taking next term with me, hopefully, if you like this course. And last year, I taught this same course in the fall, and then in the winter, I also did this companion course, which is CHSF 2107, so just one number higher, where we start with this. Okay, so and then we go all the way to the end of life, and we actually do a unit on death and dying and bereavement, or like when our loved ones die. And so I'm just kind of previewing a little bit here for the next couple slides. So early adulthood, we're going to be looking at this period of like the 20s and 30s, and I think this is where in the next part of the course students tend to find this like really relevant, because this is going to be the most directly related to a lot of your current life situation, and you're in this complex scenario. And I went on a little bit of a off rant about COVID on the last slide, but how's it been for you? How's it affected your personal development, your economic development, establishing your career? How's it affected your school? Right, so a lot of you, the career question maybe is a little bit less relevant, because you're in a scenario, I'm assuming a lot of you are in a scenario where as university students, you're making this calculation of like, I'm going to spend some of this time in my precious youth years developing so that when I enter the job market, I'm in a stronger position, and that makes complete sense. It's the whole purpose of education. You're wanting to become proficient in your career or upcoming challenges. You probably also are maybe considering ideas about like, do you want to live your life and experience your life with someone else? And so everything from dating to marriage to family. So it's this very charged period, because you're basically being asked to set up behavioral and relational patterns and strategies that will have a huge impact on the whole rest of your life. Right, like the job you work and the people that are around you. Those are two of the most significant variables in sort of your day-to-day experience of the world. Yeah, this is humbling. Yeah, I guess technically. So July 3rd is my birthday, and this summer I turned 40. So I guess according to this slide, I've technically moved into middle adulthood, and I feel fine. No, it's getting old. There's nothing wrong with getting older. It's good, but it's like what I was saying on the last slide. That's why like who you have in your life and your career are actually really big questions, because as you get older, you tend to sort of get hardwired into your patterns, so you want them to be good patterns. And you get this time I have there, like expanding personal and social involvement and responsibility. It's like you might be like, hey, Mike, why are you recording your lecture at midnight? And it's like, well, my daughter didn't go to bed till 10 tonight. It's like, that's really late for her, but she was just like so excited because she made a new friend today, and she was like kind of on a real buzz from that, and it was really cute. So we like went on a big walk at night. We have these I don't have them here, but you sometimes see people, it's like a flashlight, but you wear it on a band on your head like a miner, um, like someone that works in a mine. And me and my daughter always we each have a pair, and we always look around. I got a decent backyard, and we always like go and like look for insects and stuff at night. It's just kind of something we do. But it's like, I know I've talked about my daughters a lot, but I like being a dad of daughters, and I think, yeah, it's given me huge amounts of responsibility, but also reward. Assisting, and this kind of falls into that next point of trying to assist and help the next generation become more competent and more mature individuals, and trying to achieve and maintain career satisfaction. Maintaining career satisfaction is an interesting idea, right? Like, I've been teaching since, it's funny because I was like a kind of young teacher when I started, and not anymore. When I first started teaching, it was about 12, maybe 13 years ago. So I think I was 27 when I started. So that was like at Conestoga full time, and I think that was like relatively young. But now I'm in middle adulthood. But yeah, so it's, again, achieving and maintaining career satisfaction becomes important too, because, like, as you can see, this is a long period, and this is kind of the point I'm going to come to a bunch of times, but it's like, if you're younger, it's really important to understand this notion that the more quality you build into your life, it's like it pays itself back so many times, because you're not just one person. You're yourself today and yourself tomorrow and the next day and 5 years from now and 10 years from now and 15 years from now and 25 years from now. And it's like, if you can set yourself up both in terms of your relationship and in terms of your life, in terms of your behaviors, in terms of even your mental health and how you think and talk to yourself, if you can set yourself up to have happier days tomorrow, it's like, okay, now you're actually in the game. Now you're thinking like, I don't know who to compare you to, but now you're actually taking yourself seriously and planning on, if, okay, like, what if I actually could take care of myself and put myself in a position to have a good life, and believe that I could do that? What would I do? How would I start chipping towards that? And then the last stage we're going to look at is late adulthood. And I think when I started teaching this topic, I don't think I did this stage well. I don't think I highlighted it enough. And I don't think I was good at articulating why it's relevant. For example, say if you're a 20-year-old, why should you care about the psychological characteristics of late adulthood? Besides, like, the obvious kind of thing of like, well, one day you'll be old, but it's also like, really, I think, psychologically significant to be aware of what you're going to care about later. For example, you're not going to care later about if your boss was mad because you didn't email back quick enough one summer day in the summer of 2021. You're not going to be thinking about that when you're near the end of your days. You're going to be thinking about, was I a decent person? Could people rely on me? Did I help people? Can I think back over my life and smile? We know that when you're older, you're going to be looking at things from the perspective of, did I live a life I can be proud of? Did I contribute? And we also know you're going to, so there's that. Then there's also the fact that we know that as you get older, you tend to become more philosophical, just in general, people do. And it makes sense, because we start to become aware of our own mortality, that we're not going to be around forever. We start to, think back over our lives. And the reason I'm saying all this is, if you know that that's where you'll be later, it's like, well, how can you use that knowledge to craft a life for yourself that when you're at that end stage, you'll look back and be proud of? And I honestly think life is hard, and sometimes it's beautiful. And I've had a lot of students at Conestoga. I've had probably my program's, I don't know, I'm gonna embarrass myself if I try to do the math quick, but my program's usually about 120 people, and whatever, 13 years I've been doing it. So, and a lot of people have struggled, and I've had a lot of tough conversations with students around, like, that were in really dark places sometimes. And one thing that's spoken, that I've talked about with students, that's seemed to help, has been this concept of life can be confusing, it can be hard to know what to do, it can feel like you're completely overwhelmed, it can feel like no one's on your team. What do you do? And I think the best answer to that question is act in a way that you'll be proud of later. Try to put yourself in the mindset of your future self. Try to impress that person. Forget about everybody else. Anyways, I don't know how I got all philosophical there. It's late at night, I'm drinking coffee at midnight, and I'm 40, and now I'm all of a sudden, Johnny the philosopher. But I think it's decent advice. And I've seen people in tears cling to that. And yeah, I think it's real. So now I'd like you to add this, please, to your note, that there's different ways of kind of talking about age, and at a certain point this is just theoretical, obviously. I'm not kind of saying, or what I'm saying is kind of, it depends what we're talking about. So chronological age is what you're going to always hear, and that just means like I just told you my chronological age is 40. How old are you? Literally, how many times have you been on this spinning planet as it's rotated around the sun? It's like a fixed, finite time. But then you'll sometimes hear people talk about things, and if you're interested, Chronos is the Roman god of time. Chronos, and later in the course I'm going to do a presentation on Ion, AION, because Carl Jung uses it as a metaphor. It has relevance to psychology big time. The Greek and Roman world influenced our current thought in ways that are hard to even understand. It's where our philosophical and scientific traditions come from. Anyways, that was just a little rant. Chronos was the god of time. Chronological means like kind of, if someone says, tell me your weekend in chronological order, it means start at the beginning and tell me it along almost a timeline. So chronological age, I could have just said in 5 seconds. It's the easiest one. It's how old are you? Biological age, though, is sometimes you'll hear people say things like, oh, this guy smokes a ton of cigarettes and he has the lungs of like a 60-year-old, but he's only 40. Or you may hear the opposite, that this person like exercises all the time and they're 80 years old, but they have the lungs of a 60-year-old. So in that scenario, they're talking about biological age, what the textbook calls biological age, right? So again, this is like you have the lungs of or whatever, or someone that's a heavy drinker might have the liver of somebody that's like 20 years older than them, if you were to compare across age groups. So this is going to be the same for all three of these, that it's a comparison-based thing, right? So you could do the same thing with psychological age. Right, so, and this can be either that you're behind or you're ahead of your peer group. Right, so somebody that's like getting much older but staying really sharp, like, and we're going to talk later in the course about how to improve that, but somebody that's really cognitively challenged and engaged socially and stuff like that, compared to somebody else that same age, their psychological age might be very different, and same with their social age. How connected are they? Right, you'll hear the funny example I'll sometimes use talking about this is you'll hear people being like, oh, my grandma's like a teenager, like she goes out with her friends all the time. And so it's like she's not living in the way that we would sort of stereotype theoretically like an older person's social life. It's like I think you get the point. So sometimes they talk about these things as like chronological age, which is just basically age, and then also looking at it from the factors of biology or psychology or social life and social engagement. Okay, so the book talks about, I keep saying the book, in Developmental Psychology we talk about that there's sort of 3 different patterns of aging, right? So people age in all different ways, obviously, and one of the things that's interesting in a psychology class is a lot of these ideas in general make sense, and at an individual level break down a little bit because there's so much difference between people that it's a lot easier for me to predict how in general all of you students as a group will respond to something, but it's almost impossible for me to predict how like any one specific of you, any one individual out of your group will respond to something. It's much harder to make individual level predictions. And it's because there's so much difference. But even having said that, there's still patterns that you can find. And for example, if you look at, when kids start to walk, kids will start to walk at all different times along the spectrum. But if you were to take all those times and average it, you could find a kind of normal time to start walking. And you see how the word norm, what the norm is for when kids start to walk. And when it's normal for kids to start to walk, you see how those are almost the same word. That a norm is what's sort of the average normal. And that most individuals, their psychological function kind of peaks in early middle age, stays relatively stable until late 50s to early 60s. Most, or sort of modest or kind of slow decline throughout the early 80s. And then it's pretty interesting that individuals, and I saw this happen with my grandma, where the decline was pretty slow and then at the end it was like really fast. And that seems to be, it's like literally considered normal aging. That sort of seems to be what happens. Now, not in every scenario, but on average. Okay, so that's the first one. So then in psychology, pathological, or that there's a pathology, or that there's a problem, that a pathological, for example, individuals who may have certain cognitive impairments or Alzheimer's. So this is individuals who show greater than average decline. We'll talk about Alzheimer's more in the second half of the course, but I find that fascinating. I also find it fascinating to think like how much of Alzheimer's as a current issue is related to the fact that people are living longer, right? And if so the average age that people live has went up. The kind of range of human life hasn't really changed, right? So I don't know what you'd say the high end is, maybe 120, 125. I'm sure there's people that are maybe a year or two older than that. And that's been pretty consistent for as long back as we know. But the average person is certainly living longer. So on average, it's going up, even if the spectrum hasn't changed too much. And so my point there is, if more people are living into their 80s and 90s and 100, and is that why we're seeing more Alzheimer's? If everyone lived to 140, let's say theoretically, because really to keep you alive, you need to keep your heart alive, you need to keep your lungs alive, you need to keep your brain alive, and everything else is sort of details besides the cardiovascular nervous system and brain. Like science is going to be able to eventually get better with that stuff. But there's interesting questions that come along with that. Like, does the brain have a expiry date, basically? And is Alzheimer's something that everyone would get if we stayed alive long enough? and not necessarily Alzheimer's specifically, but different forms of dementia and cognitive impairment. I'm just kind of throwing that out as a question that, is a question of debate in psychology and developmental psych. So you can kind of see with the last two slides and then this one that it's sort of this idea of normal, and then some people it's worse than normal or pathological. For some people it's what we consider successful, and where you see I like that picture there of the lady on the bike. It's like you can kind of read into that. She looks like she probably is fit, and she obviously looks happy, and maybe she's going to bike to meet a friend or something like that. And it's like, if she can stay physically active and cognitive and social and emotionally engaged and involved in community and stuff like that, that actually affects the immune system. We'll get to that later, but that was Viktor Frankl's huge finding in Man's Search for Meaning, in his books and his writings on logotherapy, that actually feeling like your life matters and feeling like you're engaged and involved in a sense of belonging can actually affect immune system function. It can actually keep you alive. Right, so, and then we sometimes see this as a reduction in how much decline an individual has seems to be linked to these other factors like social life. And it speaks to the fact that your brain needs to be challenged, and it deteriorates when it's exposed to a lack of challenge, quite literally, to just use the same word again. And that's why it's so important when people get older to keep challenging and keep putting cognitive demand on the brain. And it's why actually teaching your grandparents how to play video games would be a really smart move, or teaching them how to play Tetris, or word searches, or all those kind of things that are kind of like skill, cognitive, puzzly kind of things. Because, and I'll talk about this a lot because my brother actually did a lot of research on he's a psychologist, and he did a lot of research on the kind of switch from what we consider someone with Alzheimer's to somebody that we don't yet consider to have Alzheimer's, and what that line is, and what different kinds of tasks like puzzles and different kinds of memory focused tasks people on the one group struggle with and the other group doesn't, and kind of where the line is of what we consider that kind of impairment. That's just a side rant, but I think that's kind of interesting, and we'll talk a lot about Alzheimer's in the second course. So a big idea in developmental psych and in psychology in general and in social sciences in general and just in life is this constant back and forth between nature and nurture. And if you want to think of nature as this idea of kind of our genetics or who we are, and then nurture is our environment or our learning or our parenting or our schooling, and you basically look at nature is who you are, and then nurture is the world that you're born into, and that these have huge effects on each other. And you'll see in the history of psychology there's been push in both directions, right? You've had, say for example, someone like Freud, who isn't necessarily always talked about this way, but I believe very much was talking about genetics and was basically making an argument for these internal drives, which we would now call just basically genetic forces. And then we had people like, say, Skinner and the behavioralist and Pavlov that were basically like, or the famously Watson, who did the little Albert experiments, who said like, give me any kid and I'll turn them into like a plumber or a soldier or a doctor. Just depends on crafting the right situation, the right learning environment. So that's like a hard nurture argument. Nowadays we understand that almost everything is some dynamic combination of the two things. You act the way you do on a date or in a job interview or in a classroom by some kind of complicated interaction between those two things. Your biology, and you're like a cultured biology. that's learned in a social world. We'll get to that. That's Erikson's big idea, that your psychosocial, that your psychology and your social world co-evolve and are interconnected dynamically. It's a pretty deep idea, actually, if you kind of step back and think about what he means then, and then what he meant when he brought up ideas like people having trust issues as kids, and how that might reappear later when you're in the dating scene, or like how identity affects you as a teenager, or how feelings of if you have integrity or despair looking back over your life as a later adult. And he's looking at this idea of how you can't isolate our social or our psychological mental health from our social engagement with our world. So I went on a big kind of a rant there, but I wanted to add this to your note, just that an easy way to say it is nature is sort of an organism's biological inheritance. Not sort of, it's exactly what it is. It's what that organism is and what it inherited from its parents, theoretically. Yeah, I guess it'd be parents in every scenario. I was trying to think, like, what you call it? Animals, definitely parents. I guess you'd call it plants, the parent plant too. And then nurture is, well, the environment that organism is in. So any organism, anything that's any organic organism is a biological thing that then exists in a world. You already know that, but I think that's why it's kind of cool, that picture of like the double helix of the DNA with the globe inside it. I thought that was kind of cool. So nature and nurture are useful concepts for talking about things like stability and change, like stability meaning why some things continue. Like, say, for example, an addiction or something, and then change might be in that same example, like how sometimes a pattern can get broken, even one that's gotten hardwired and that's been persistent for a long time. So nature and nurture can help us with understanding basically why things stay the same and sometimes change. This is the same idea as continuity and discontinuity. And then the next point I wanted to say here, that there's quantitative and quantitative, discontinuous and continuous. So what do I mean by that? I mean, the language on this slide, don't worry too much about it. It's a little bit confusing, but all it means is that sometimes the change in difference is something we could put a number to. So the example I tried to add here to help explain is, if you look at the average woman's height in Canada in 1914, it's 5'2". In 2014, 100 years later, it's 5'4" on average woman's height. So the average woman's height 100 years later is 2 inches taller. That's pretty interesting. That's something you could put a scale on, right? You could quantify that. So that'd be considered quantitative. Right? And the word quantitative means you could basically quantify it. You could put a number to it. Qualitative means it's not just a different amount, like the other word. Qualitative means it's a whole different type of thing, and that's why I use the idea of identity. It's like, my daughter at 5 has an identity. You at 25, maybe, say you're 25. Your experience of identity is completely different. It's still a thing, but we use the same word. But it's not like you just have more identity than my daughter. It's that your identity it's a completely different style. It's a different type. It's a difference in thing. Or it's a difference in quality. That's where the word comes from. Qualitative. Yeah, difference in quality. Okay, so before I kind of switch directions a little bit, just a couple last things I need to kind of do to set some groundwork or foundation I got caught between those two words. A theory. What is a theory in psychology? So I'm about to use the example of the bystander effect, which you've probably heard of. I have a really short video I'm going to include here just to kind of show you what the bystander effect refers to. So this is a scenario where when people are in trouble in public, so the example I always use is if you're walking down the hallway at the school that you're at Nipissing, and you see a fellow student who you maybe don't know on the ground in agony and in trouble, you're probably going to go and help them. But if you're with the big crowd that passes that same person, you're actually statistically less likely to help. And it's because, well, the responsibility to help is kind of shared across the group, and it's why no one does anything. They call that the diffusion of responsibility, the spreading out of responsibility to the point that actually no one takes personal responsibility. Now that's a theory. What that is I said a bunch of different things. So it's like, oh, because you act differently when you're around people and when you're not. Why I think that's the case, which is because there's this spreading or this diffusion of responsibility, and that actually affects behavior, because responsibility and behavior, felt responsibility socially and behavior are somehow linked. So what I'm trying to say there is that's actually a bunch of ideas that are connected around this one idea. So this theory is this interrelated, coherent set of ideas used to explain something and make predictions, right? So then, based on what I just said, I would predict that if you were in these two hypothetical situations, in the one where you were by yourself, you'd be more likely to help. Okay, so say that's my idea. So now that's a hypothesis. So we need to test that. And we need to test that by creating okay, so what's the problem? We're going to look at if whether or not other people are with you is going to have a significant effect on your behavior when you're exposed to someone that needs help. We'd run some experiments, probably with more people than just one subject to be, not just you. Collect research, analyze it, draw conclusions. It's how we do science. Okay, so I'm going to show this clip about the bystander effect, and then I'm going to just talk a little bit about scientific method, and then I'm probably going to go to bed tonight, but you at home can just pause because I'm going to make this one big video, or you don't have to pause. I'm going to get back into it in the morning. To you, it'll just look like a scene switch, except for the fact that I highlighted it, and I'll probably be wearing a new shirt in the morning. But what I usually notice is that as I get kind of into the course, and I've done a few videos, I'm kind of shy all of a sudden because I haven't made a video since my course in the spring. So once I kind of get in the groove, I'll talk less about my process and about what time I'm going to bed and random comments like that. No, but maybe you like it. My daughter gets up super early, so I gotta be conscious of the time, because my daughter won't care if I was working on the PowerPoint. She's gonna be up for sure at like 6:45. So again, I don't need to say that out loud. So in this next slide, it's going to look at this idea of the bystander effect. I hope you're enjoying this. This is the last time I'll say it. I like doing these. I find it pretty fun, and yeah, I hope that these are at least decent to watch. Okay, so the bystander effect coming up next.
Plays like this street in New York City. If you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help! Help!
How long before he gets help?
Please, somebody. Help! Help me, sir. Please help me.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help. And it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Four minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright? You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit clicky, you know what I mean?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
You want to sit up?
She don't look well, does she?
You alright, yeah? What's wrong?
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her, because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm alright.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group. Everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
And I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
So this is really the core of the scientific method, right? You have some kind of research question, like does a bystander effect exist? And the question is like actually more specific, like does the presence of others affect our sense of responsibility in a situation where there's help required? And the hypothesis would be that yes, it does, that actually when there's this diffusion of responsibility idea, that it gets spread out amongst the group. So we could create an experiment to test that, draw certain results or conclusions from that, and see is the hypothesis supported. And if it is, then it says like the final result part is to actually like report your results. And then if it's not supported, do you report those results too? Because it's like lots of studies have negative result, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. It's just showing that hypothesis didn't pan out, and sometimes it's very interesting to look at why. Right, and then the green there represents that, like in a true research sense, you'd be going back to the top, and you're always questioning why. Right, if you can't question it, it's not science, it's propaganda. Questioning and going back to the drawing board is the core to the scientific method. Okay, so again, you're not going to notice a difference. I don't even need to highlight this, but I'm going to start back up on this on slide 26 tomorrow. And yeah, I'm getting close to halfway through this, and we're at about an hour and a half. I'm kind of looking at this is probably going to be close to 3 hours or so when it's done, but I hope it's digestible and decent and not too hard to watch. Alright, anyways, have a great day, night, whatever. I don't need to make an ending in the middle of this, but I'm going to go to bed, and I'll see you in the morning with a fresh coffee, and I'll get back into this. Alright, cheers. Welcome to part 2. So we're going to get into these theories of development that come from psychology. And I was going to change, I know I'm in a t-shirt, but I was about to change, but I thought you might think it's cool. This is from the camp that we go with the kids to, Camp Canonia, blood donors at Big Mosquito. It's like, I figure I got enough mosquito bites this summer to earn the shirt, and I thought you guys might find it funny if you're up there in North Bay. I'm sure you have a few deer flies and horse flies up there. Yeah, what would the Canadian wilderness be without deer flies, horse flies, and mosquitoes, right? Well, it'd be better, but anyways. Here's your look behind the scenes. I considered cutting that, but I think I'll leave it. Alright, so what I want to do in this next part is start with Freud and tell a kind of short story. And with my Conestoga students, I tend to do this presentation called History of Therapeutic Psych, where I do a more comprehensive overview of these people. But what I've decided to do in this course is do a little bit more of a brief overview here, and then pull in their content hard when we're on topics that are relevant to these people specifically. Right, so like Freud, especially in the early years, emotional development and stuff like that, and Piaget mainly, when we're going to talk about him mainly during like the school years, and I'm going to kind of apply the main theoretical perspectives when it makes sense. All right, but let's start with Freud, as one should when they're teaching psych. So Freud's a very hard person to explain quickly, and I think I've probably already said this in this course because I say it constantly, that I think Freud is highly misunderstood, largely because he was talking about things that we would now interpret mainly as genetic and biological at a time when a lot of the language didn't exist. So he was telling he was insightful, and he was a doctor that was meeting with his patients, and they were telling him about things that didn't seem to have direct causes, and he was, well, psychoanalyzing them. And so he was writing the book. He wasn't reading the book and trying it. He was writing the book, and then others came later and critiqued and whatever, but it's like it's so much easier to be the one coming next, critiquing the first one. It's much more impressive to have the original idea, to actually take this idea that there's an unconscious mind, that there's a lot of you that's under the surface. More of that tree is under the surface. That I just thought that was a cool picture. Usually the picture I use is the iceberg, is the classic Freud image, iconography. And it's like, his idea is that development happens in terms of these processes that are at play, and that they're at play under the water and at a level that's unconscious, heavily influenced by emotion. The psychoanalytic theorists like Freud, his daughter Anna Freud, Erikson, Jung, they all believed in this idea that behavior is more of a surface characteristic, a reflection of a deeper emotional, energetic, psychodynamic. And that true understandings of development require analysis of behavior and the deep workings of the mind, because to see what some of these influencing forces might be, what his student Carl Jung would later go on to call shadow content. And so his idea is that pleasure and sexuality have this role in development, but not in an adult way all the time. And that, because he also talks about, like, say, feeding when the baby's first born, and that there's actually survival, evolutionary, biological reasons why the baby is designed to take physical pleasure from feeding. If the baby didn't, it would be less motivated to do it. If the baby's less motivated to do it, it's less motivated to seek mom's attention. If that happens less, chances of survival for the baby are lower. My point is that this is hardwired biology. He's talking about it before the ability to say that sentence existed. People wouldn't have known what he meant if he was talking about phenotypes and genotypes. Alright, but we'll cover that in this course, and I'm going to try to make this connection that Freud almost started this game, and then everyone came after and was critiquing and building, and then genetics kind of came and was like, oh, wait a sec, you're not all just social constructions. There's a biochemical organism at play here. I think my wife was calling me, so see you on the next. So this idea that Freud and his idea of the unconscious is maybe the biggest idea in Western academic history. Like, it's right up there. And this is the image I was mentioning before, is that so much of our experience exists at that level that's outside of our immediate awareness, that's below the waves, that's we couldn't articulate and tell someone else no matter how much time we had. It's not subconscious, it's not in that region sort of between those two white lines. It's unconscious, it's not material available for us to recall, but its energy still exists. It still exists. It's still very much a thing. And that idea alone, every psychologist that came after Freud had to deal with. It didn't matter if they disagreed with certain aspects of his theory, or they thought he was wrong about this, or this idea is hard to test, or whatever. It's like, okay, there's an unconscious part of us that influences us at a level that's really uncomfortable to think about how much. Somewhere in the 90%. It's the biggest idea in psychology. And it's why Freud's Freud, and it's why, he stands beside people like Shakespeare, in my opinion. Okay.
Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. Dr. Sigmund Freud. I'm in the original European Inner World Masters Psychoanalysis home office, sitting in a reclining chair where Dr. Sigmund Freud analyzed patients from between 1891 and 1938. A psychoanalyst's couch, like the one Freud's patients lay on in search of relief from inner world turmoil, is stretched out in front of me. I'm writing step 4 to you from Vienna, Austria. Imagine how the Victorian era Viennese public must have reacted when Dr. Freud first introduced the idea to the world that our behaviors are driven by all sorts of things that occurred in our past, and which are often not at all conscious to us in the present. Over 100 years ago, that culture-rattling insight changed the course of history. Foremost, because it changed the way we understand how our self develops. Dr. Freud recognized that we're each exposed to formative experiences and insights, and that although we may have forgotten those important events, they are continuing to inform the moment-to-moment recreation of ourself, and so how we feel and express ourselves each moment today. Dr. Freud taught us that many of the experiences that influence how our self is produced today occurred before we were able to form lasting conscious memories at all. Although all of our life's experiences cannot necessarily be brought into our conscious awareness as memories today, Dr. Freud saw that they often left a lasting impact on how we behave and what automatic emotions we experience throughout life. Unconscious experiences derived from early life events influence your habits, choices, and behaviors throughout your life. Your unconscious history form the iterations of yourself that rise off your bridge of translation today. Dr. Freud observed that moments of challenge or trauma often continued to grow within and emerged in a morphed form as emotions and behaviors later in life. He saw that some seeds planted flower over time, while other seeds grow and decay. Either way, unconsciously planted seeds often morph into new aspects of your life by changing the moment-to-moment contents automatically occurring in your inner dialogue, and so becoming the different versions of yourself each moment.
So another, probably one of the most famous psychoanalysts, it's tough because it's a star-studded list. Carl Jung and Frankl and Freud and Freud himself are all on that list too, but Erik Erikson you've probably heard of, and we're going to talk about a lot in a course like this, and about his psychosocial idea that I was mentioning earlier about how our psychology develops, almost said evolves, but remember we're going to try to in this course use the word that evolve means over multiple lifetimes and develop means within one lifetime. He's looking at how development is psychosocial is his word. And what's interesting to keep in mind is that Erikson was attracted to psychoanalysis first in the role as a patient. He was going through things himself, and he found his process so enlightening and so life-changing and so inspiring that he became an analyst himself. Now think about it, he's this guy that, and oh yeah, he also had studied the Montessori method, which is another kind of idea about how to do child instruction. And it's interesting to note that even though he never received like formal education, like he didn't have a bachelor's degree, but he went on to teach at places like Harvard and Yale and become like somebody that's usually taught, as it is here, sort of second in the history of developmental psychology, like basically Freud, Erikson, and Piaget. Freud, Erikson, Piaget, Mary Ainsworth. I'm trying to quick go through the life cycle. James Marquet. Not as much though. And then it's gonna be guys like Frankl and Carl Rogers and stuff in later life. Oh, you look so sad. So okay, so I'm gonna bail on the baby idea, but actually, let's see if you calm back down. But Erik Erikson. So now let's get into his work. But I wanted to make this point. It's interesting who he was. He was a student of Freud, best friends with Freud's daughter, benefited from psychoanalysis himself, got into it, and kind of dedicated his life to spreading these ideas of how, look at her face, it's hilarious. She's like totally just laughing it up. A live camera reset. So yeah, so Erik Erikson, and I'm trying to sort of overkill this point. Part of it was I'm obviously a little bit distracted on this slide, but I want to try to make this point of how these were people that knew each other, and that the development of psychology is actually really interesting, because Freud and Carl Jung and Erik Erikson, like Erik Erikson was literally good friends with Freud's daughter, and Anna Freud was an absolute giant in the early field of psychology and a massive defender of her father. And so, and then later we're going to get all these other people coming, and all of them know Freud, and all of them are responding to this idea of the unconscious mind. Okay. Yeah, so this point for your note here, I'm just going to put it all up, and I can set this down and do the dad rock a little bit. So the idea here, humans develop in psychosocial stages, and that our motivation in life is often social. Right, like the baby that I'm holding right now, her world is being shaped by the world of the people around her. And she's trying to figure out this first purple one there, this idea of trust versus mistrust. Like, is this world safe or not? And the idea is that the answer to that question actually has massive developmental impacts. It's, according to Erikson, the key developmental task of early life. Right, or then if we look at something like what a lot of you might be at the stage of now, of intimacy versus isolation, not even to mention the current situation, how much difficulty that would add to everything. And it's like, can you learn that how to develop and cultivate relationships of deep, true intimacy? Do you agree? And because his worry was that just like the baby can learn not to trust, we can learn, well, we can experience isolation, psychological isolation. He said you could be in a marriage or a relationship or surrounded by people and still feel isolated. Okay, so the next huge wave in psychology after the psychoanalytic wave, the Freud and the Freudian school, comes this idea of actually to understand humanity, we need to understand behavior and how people learn and how behaviors change and how certain behaviors are maintained and how certain behaviors extinguish. And there's kind of two big ones here, and I'm going to show a short video on Pavlov on the next slide, but typically you'd talk about him first just because he comes first chronologically, historically, timeline-wise. But kind of the huge idea here is from Skinner, and this idea of operant conditioning, and this idea that like the consequence of the behavior, if understood by the participant, will influence the behavior. So if I think that I'm going to do something and it's going to be received well, that shapes my behavior. And sorry, I don't have notes here. I know it looks like I'm like drawing on the table or something, but it's just how I kind of think. And so the idea in operant conditioning is that, and we're going to get into this more later, and we'll talk about how he trained his rats and his pigeons to turn certain directions and to do all kinds of stuff, and how he was even involved with the military and with Project Orcon and trying to use those same pigeons to guide missiles pre-GPS. And so Skinner had this idea that our development happens through behaviors that we learn through interactions with our surroundings. I just straight read that first point, but that's actually a good way of saying it, that as you're born into a world that has certain challenges to you. You respond to those challenges, and in the process of responding to those challenges, development happens almost as a behavioral outcome. And you can see how this word behavior becomes so central to the whole, well, it's behaviorism, basically, scientifically observing what can be observed. It's like, you can tell me, Skinner would, this isn't a direct quote, but he'd say something like this. It's like, how do you act when you're at a bar and you see somebody that you're attracted to, but you're nervous to talk to them? Like, what would you do in that situation? And he's like, I don't care what the person would answer to that verbally. There's only one way to know, and it's to put somebody in a situation and observe. That was like a really specific example I used, but like his basic idea is that behaviors can be shaped and observed, and that a lot of why we think we do things is kind of story that our brain fills after. That development is observable behavior learned through experience with the environment. That's a pretty blunt way of saying it. And then what we're going to see on the next slide is this idea of classical conditioning. So that's Pavlov's idea of associating two things. And conditioning basically means the same thing as learning or training. So he's talking about, so classical conditioning, therefore, classical meaning like kind of the most fundamental type of learning is associating things, right? You associate that when the bell rings in high school, that means class is over. You pull up to the light and it goes red, you associate that with stopping. There's like a million different things that you've just learned to associate together. A smell of something with something positive or negative. And then Skinner comes along and says, well, okay, but yeah, but also there's more complex things than that. Sometimes we do things and we get burned for it and things go bad and we experience negative feedback, and that has a behavioral shaping effect on our system. And sometimes we do things and get rewarded for it, and that has this shaping effect on the system too. Learning that specific consequences are associated with voluntary behavior, that the pigeon turns when the pigeon is rewarded to turn. When you don't reward the pigeon to turn, the pigeon stops turning. And this idea becomes like a huge idea in psychology for a while. And there's points to be made from the behavioral perspective. Any kind of anger management theory, training, anger management training, assertiveness training, social skills training, all those kind of things are all behavioral techniques. And based on this idea that like so much of who you are is what you do, so much so to the sense, and you're unconsciously sort of, they wouldn't use the word unconscious, but you're unconsciously watching yourself do this, and it's shaping how you're seeing yourself. And like, even if you look at something like depression, one of the big things with depression is getting people back doing what they were doing before they were depressed, because there's something inherent in that activity that's therapeutic. Okay, so this next video is a little bit about Pavlov, then we're going to make the jump to the cognitive theorists. So there's sort of these 5 big waves, right? Freud's school, and then a group of people basically saying, forget all that psychodynamic stuff. What matters to understand humans is to know their behavior. And then this other group saying, well, obviously simplifying, but this other group coming and saying, like, basically, okay, that's great, but what's going on between the person's ears as they're making sense of their world, and how is that informative of what being human is? Then you get this other group of people responding largely to the behavioralists saying, like, we're not just animals, because at that time even places like University of Waterloo near here had rhesus monkeys and had monkey labs, and it was so much of psychology was animal experimentation. And the humanists made this argument that, well, you see the word right there, that there's this human aspect, and humanist means sort of something different outside of psychology and has been associated with different political movements and stuff. Within psychology, that, I think a better way to say it would probably be the growth psychologists, because we're really talking about a pretty wide range of people. We're talking about people like Carl Rogers, who basically started therapy or counseling. We're talking about Viktor Frankl, who I've talked about a little bit in logotherapy. We're talking about Fritz Perls and Gestalt therapy. We're talking about Maslow and the ideas around self-actualization. Those would be the huge ones. So, and then the last wave is sort of kind of touching on every level, is this emerging, developing understanding of genetics and biology. And that as the field of psychology is growing, things like brain scans are getting way better. Our understanding of the central nervous system is getting way better. Our understanding of genetics and inheritance and how all those kind of things work is getting way better. So I hope you find that. I'm trying to tell this as the story of this last 130 years, right? To give context to then all the stuff we're going to talk about that's more sort of currently relevant in the next couple weeks. This is the field that you're studying when you're studying psychology.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
That last video was pretty classic footage. I hope that YouTube lets me, the overlords at YouTube let me keep that little clip in there, but, extra credit, no, I was going to say, like, bonus question, who is that guy? Do you know who that was? Because you've probably heard of the Stanford prison experiments, so that's the guy that did those. His name's Philip Zimbardo. Also wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect. And most famous for the Stanford prison experiments for sure, but it seems like he had a phase, maybe like one summer or whatever, he got like pitched the idea of making like a bunch of, well, like little videos like that kind of explain a concept for a psych class. It seems like he must have done that, because there's a few I'm going to use throughout this course that are just kind of these nice things, like they just kind of explain classical conditioning, like an old school kind of a YouTube video, but looks like it was shot a good time ago. So anyways, so I want to get into now this, so I just used Pavlov and Skinner to sort of represent in general that shift towards behavioralism. I could have also talked about Edward Thorndike and his cat puzzle boxes, or well, Watson obviously in the Little Albert experiment. I'll spare you the details of that study, where he basically proved this idea that you can teach a child to be fearful. And the next movement coming is this cognitive movement, and the biggest name in this is going to be Piaget and Vygotsky in Russia. And so these two people had huge impacts on school, and it's kind of hard to overestimate how much of an impact Piaget had, especially since he really started to challenge this idea that kids are just little adults. And if you want to ever find a kind of depressing YouTube video, if you look up, I think it's called The Children Who Built Victorian Europe, and it talks about, or Victorian London maybe, just how rough it was being a kid even a few hundred years ago. But Piaget was really trying to make this point that actually a child at different ages aren't just smarter at the same thing. They're actually using entirely different, what he's calling like almost logical systems, or he talks about these levels of cognitive development. And so on this slide I just wanted to stress this idea that cognitive here, and you probably already sort of know this, like when we say cognitive, we're really talking about kind of like the work, the mental activity that your brain does. Your applied intelligence, your use of language, problem solving, thinking, memory, attention, perception, all this kind of, in kind of the simplest way you could say the work that your brain does. It's this applied cognitive system. Mike, is that your mind? Ooh, now there's a question. I would say it's part of it. Okay, next slide. So I'd like you to add this to your note, please, and I'll kind of just walk through this chart on the side. And I know I'm cutting off like half of a word there, and it's the word sensory. So it says, and you don't have to write this word for word, but it actually, this is weird because I actually maybe would say write it word for word if you want, because it actually is pretty succinct. So it's saying like the sensory motor stage, and I'm just talking about this image on the right. This is actually a cool idea, and when I had my baby down a couple slides ago, her whole world is what she's seeing and hearing and touching and tasting and smelling. And then like, so that's the sensory part, like what's coming in the sensory organs as stimuli, or just anything that you're responding to. And then the motor piece of movement, that's her whole world right now. And it's how she's actually engaging the outside almost. The infant's exploring the world through this direct sensory and motor contact. We start to see the emergence of things like object permanence. Right, so I'm going to give some more examples when we get to it in the course, but object permanence basically is like this idea that you all know that this chair that you're seeing in the video exists between videos, right? But to the child's mind, it's almost like when mom's not there, it's like mom's gone. Even if, and as they start to get smarter, they start to realize that, like, well, it's why peekaboo stops working, because all of a sudden they realize, like, it's just your hands in front of your face. You're not actually coming in and out of reality. I don't know if that was a good way of explaining it, but that's basically the term object permanence, that objects are permanent, regardless of your, I don't know, current sensory observation of them. And then we also see the emergence of things like separation anxiety, which is a little more self-explanatory. I'm sure you know sort of what that means, or maybe you're quite familiar with that concept, but we'll talk about that a lot when we're talking about, in a couple weeks, infancy. So then his idea is that that's sort of like 0 to 2, and all these stages, a critique that people make, and it's like, and they think it's the strongest critique ever, and it's a very average critique of a model, very kind of basic critique of a model, is that it's not as model-like as it seems. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, every time you try to take a complex theory and make it into something that we can explain in one little 4-step process, it's like Piaget was an intellectual giant, and he basically had this idea that kids develop their thinking in ways that are, each step's qualitatively different than the one before. It's not quantitatively different. We talked about that word a little while ago, right? Quantitatively different would mean you're just 2 times smarter, 3 times better memory, and it's like something you could put like a score to, like a video game attribute. He's saying that's not what it is. It's like, it's different systems. This is a weird metaphor, but it's like a Nintendo, and then an N64, and then like a Nintendo GameCube or a Wii, and then it's like the Nintendo Switch. It's like, I don't know if that's actually not the greatest metaphor. Well, maybe it is actually, because they're completely different softwares. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't try to think through that metaphor. I just freestyled live into this recording. It might make for boring video, but I don't know. I don't know if I believe what I just said, but I think it's interesting maybe just to explain it. So the next stage there pre-operationally says between 2 to 6, the child moves into this stage where they start to be able to be more symbolic in the representation of things, right? So they start to be able to use words, right? That instead of just pointing and grabbing at this, like this is like water, right? And it's like, that's actually a huge thing. It all of a sudden makes, well, the development of language transforms us from other species, right? And I'll go on to, I'll talk about dolphins and some of the primates and elephants and stuff later, but like in general, one of the things that makes humans so different is this advanced language ability. The child has this developing ability to pretend, and pretend play becomes super important. The child, though, at this stage, and like my daughter would be an example of that, like it's egocentric's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're saying like some guy or girl you're dating as an adult is egocentric, then that's a bad thing, because you're saying like they only care about themselves and they see everything from their perspective, and that's sort of what you would mean if you're using that term. But when you're talking about like a 5-year-old, it's like, of course they are. They don't, Piaget would say, they're not at a cognitive level yet to take another person's perspective. And that's so important for, like, say, for example, me to take into account when I'm driving and maybe me and my wife are not necessarily arguing, maybe we're like trying to figure out how to go somewhere and it's like stressful and there's lots of traffic and my daughter in the back's like on me about something that's unrelated and she's like, Daddy, I thought, can we go to the store? The sticker store, that's what she calls like the dollar store, because she just, ever since she was little, she like going there and getting stickers. So anyway, so maybe she's like on me about that, and it's like part of me wants to be like, can't you see that you're like, I'm trying to figure something out and that's a distracting influence? It's like, no, she can't. She's not putting herself in my cognitive shoes yet. She's ego, meaning the part of her that is her centric. And then when the child gets into this kind of 7 to 12 years, the child starts to be able to think more logically about things. So you're starting to add and subtract. And I don't mean that obviously an 11-year-old can't add and subtract, but the ability to manipulate thoughts more than a math kind of idea. The child starts to understand things like conversion, that like something in a tall, skinny, I'm going to show a video in a second that's going to explain this a little bit more and with graphics and stuff, but that like if you take a glass and pour it into a thinner glass that's taller, it's still the same amount of liquid. It's like children constantly get that wrong when they're young, and once they get to a certain age they find that like super easy to know. And he thought that was interesting. It's not, it was almost predictable on how they answered that question based just on how old they are. Now there's going to always be variation, right? You might be sitting there thinking like, well, I had a kid that could do that before, or I had a kid that could do that later, and that just is speaking to the uniqueness of humanity. But in general, it's a good point, but it's a point that's going to be able to be made a lot of times, because it's sort of just saying people are unique, and the idea that people are unique is just sort of taken as a given in developmental psych. It's like, yep. Okay, so anyways, on average, because it's trying to use a scientific method to look at the human mind. And there's inherent problems with that, but that doesn't mean that you can't understand how a child would. Because when you actually ask like really hard question, like what is thinking? It's like, well, a child's thinking is all kinds of things. It's how it's accessing memory and using that memory in the moment to form its interpretation. It's what even is interpretation? What's perception? What's the difference between perception and sensation? It's not like you see something and then you think about what you think about it. That happens bang, right at the point of contact. Right? Merleau-Ponty had a book called The Primacy of Perception. It's like, it's right there at the start. It's prime. It's not secondary. And this evolving cognitive system between your ears is like, it's so, and this is kind of where I'm kind of trying to go with all this. It's so psychodynamic. It's so behavioral. It's so cognitive. It's so self-realizing, and it's the mind of this genetically, biologically grounded, embodied organism. And that's you. And that's why I think psychology is the ultimate topic.
Piaget's theory argues that we have to conquer 4 stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. Second, the pre-operational stage. Third, the concrete operational stage. And fourth, the formal operational stage. Only once we have gone through all the stages, at what age can vary, we are able to reach full human intelligence. 1. The sensory motor stage, ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop through experiences and movement our 5 senses. Our brain wants to see, hear, smell, taste and touch as much as possible. First, we start with simple reflexes, and soon after we develop our first habits. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond our own body, and then as we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget terms, our realization of object permanence. Before that, our mum can show and then hide a teddy, and we would think it's gone. After, we understand that objects continue to exist even when we can't see them. We start becoming curious about everything. We want to smell flowers, taste food, listen to sounds, and talk to strangers. To explore more, we move. We learn to sit, crawl, stand, walk, and even to run. This increased physical mobility consequently leads to increased cognitive development. But we remain egocentric, meaning we can perceive the world only from our own point of view. 2. The pre-operational stage, ages 2 to 7. Our thinking is mainly categorized through symbolic functions and intuitive thoughts. We have lots of fantasies and believe objects are alive. As we are not able to apply specific cognitive operations, Piaget calls this stage pre-operational. We learn to speak and understand that words, images, and gestures are symbols for something else. When we draw our family, we are not concerned about drawing each person to scale, but rather with their symbolic meanings. We love to play pretend, which allows us to experience something new and learn a lot. At around age 4, most of us become very curious and ask many questions. We want to know everything. We can call it the birth of primitive reasoning. Piaget calls it the intuitive age, because while we realize that we have a vast amount of knowledge, we have no idea how we acquired it. Our thinking in this stage is still pretty egocentric. We think others see the world like we do, and still don't understand that they see it differently. 3. The concrete operational stage, ages 7 to 11. We finally discover logic and we develop concrete cognitive operations, such as sorting objects in a certain order. One example of this is inductive reasoning, which means that if we see someone eating a cookie, we can draw a conclusion and then make a generalization. And we now get the concept of conservation. We understand that if we pour orange juice from a normal glass to a taller one, the amount stays the same. Our younger sister will pick the taller glass, thinking she gets more. By the same logic, we only now can understand that if 3 plus 5 equals 8, then 8 minus 3 must equal 5. Our brain learns to rearrange our thoughts, to classify and build concrete operational mental structures. For example, we now know that we can reverse an action by doing the opposite. Excited by our new mental abilities, we apply them in conversations, activities, when we learn to write, and in school. As a result, we get to know ourselves better. We begin to understand that our thoughts and feelings are unique and not necessarily those of others. That means that we learn to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. 4. The formal operational stage, age 12 plus. Once we become teenagers, we become formally operational. We now have the ability to think more rationally about abstract concepts and hypothetical events. Our advanced cognitive abilities allow us to understand abstract concepts such as success and failure, love and hate. We form a deeper understanding of our own identity and our morality. We now also think that we understand why people behave the way they behave, and as a result, can become more compassionate. Our brain can now do deductive reasoning, which means we can compare two statements and reach a logical generalization. Our new mental skills allow us to plan our life systematically and prioritize, and we can make assumptions about events that have no necessary relation to reality. We can now also philosophize and just think about thinking itself. Our new sense for our identity now also creates egocentric thoughts, and some start to see an imaginary audience watching them all the time. Piaget believed in lifelong learning, but insisted that the formal operational stage is the final stage of our cognitive development. Jean Piaget's first interests were animals, and he published his first scientific paper on albino sparrows in 1907 when he was just 11 years old. In 1920, he began working with standardized intelligence tests. He realized that younger children consistently make types of mistakes that older children do not. He concluded that they must think differently and spent the rest of his life studying the intellectual development of children.
So that last video just covered those 4 stages. If you're following along with the PowerPoint that I uploaded, you might notice I've actually dropped 2 slides. So I was going to do a slide on those stages, the 4 stages that the video was just about, but the video covers it, and I think I'm going to save my more in-depth look into them for when we get to those specific spots. What I kind of did a live switch here, so what I want to do instead is kind of really focus on this idea. If they're in your presentation, you don't have to like scrap them or anything. It makes total sense. It's just basically what the video said in slide form. So cognitive theory is this idea of looking at conscious thought, like looking at what's going on in the mind. And notice that the word conscious thought, right? So it's not even inherently anti-Freudian. It's looking at this idea of, okay, well, I don't know, maybe I'll let you think about what that means. It's interesting to think, right, that like the first thing I would have on the slide is it's conscious. We're talking about conscious thought now. We're talking about decision making, the use of recall. So anything that you're recalling is definitionally conscious. Your ability to plan, how you think through certain kind of pros and cons kind of things, your ability to figure out maps and puzzles and that kind of stuff. Those are all like cognitive skills. And also this point I made before about perception. That's like maybe one of the biggest ones that shapes our experience, how we actually make sense of our world. And that children do it in a way that's unique, and that they're actually, this is sort of, this long rant I've been making has been leading to this point. This is what I actually would like you to please write down. Children aren't just less smart adults. That's actually that's actually just incorrect. It's just straight up wrong. It's not like a limited or simple understanding of it. It's just straight up wrong. Children have completely unique systems of thought that are actually cultivating and fostering of the levels that come next. And the idea is that the levels that come next might not even be possible without the levels below. And that children are actually constructing these personal understandings of the world, and that it's actually key to the mind's development that this stage is more imaginative and more playful and more dramatic sometimes. Pretend. Dramatic meaning like drama, not like necessarily emotional, but emotional too. And it's Piaget really, the second point, really stresses this idea of how age is related to this. Now, of course, again, there's individual variation, but that if you were to scale how everyone moves through these stages, you'd be surprised by the amount of similarity. Psychology has gotten too wrapped in that question sometimes, like, should we or should we not care about norms and averages, right? Norms is sort of the old school psychology word for an average. What's the norm? You can see how it's linked to the word normal. I already made that point in this presentation, but it's good to kind of always have that in mind, because that's all it is. It's not necessarily implying that there's anything wrong with being off that norm in any direction, right? With something like intelligence, it'd be great to be off that norm. For something like athletic performance or ability to withstand, I don't know, low amounts of water for our ancestors in a survival situation, it's like deviation from the norm isn't inherently problematic. And I think so sometimes, for an example would be like when early research on norms started, and mothers, understandably, right, because they wanted their kids to do well, and all of a sudden their kid's not walking as early as some other kids or crawling, and then you realize, well, things tend to even out, and maybe even though it's interesting, maybe we shouldn't be too focused on it. So Piaget, like, his influence is across the board in how we understand the child mind. Or child cognition is probably a better word. Yeah, I keep saying this, but that it's qualitatively different in each of those stages. And remember, that means that it's not like a number difference, it's a totally different thing. So, one of the big Russian contributions to developmental psychology has been Vygotsky, and I'll give you his name and his main points on the next slide. But I just sort of wanted to use this image that I just found on the internet to sort of explain. And that's what those, if you're wondering, I don't know if it's I hope it works, but those little like QR codes on the bottom are supposed to link to the video for whatever. I mean the image for copyright or whatever. So what this idea is that through manipulation of the learning environment, you can increase performance. So if you can have a situation where you get somebody's attention, so say if I'm trying to teach you how to write, if I can first of all get you to pay attention, second of all understand exactly where you're at, and then model for you how to get to the next level. So it requires me being able to accurately assess where you're at and accurately model the correct next step. I think a good example for something like this would be something like martial art training, right? So you're training someone in a martial art. A good teacher is able to see where that student's at and see what the next level of performance would be, and see how to model the stepping stone between those two things. And the stepping stone between where you're at and where you could be is what Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development, the zone that you could develop to from here to here. Proximity means, like, right now my proximity to you is closer. Right now it's further than right now. Proximity means the distance between two things, right? So you're saying, like, if I'm teaching martial arts to somebody and they're a beginner and I'm modeling things that are too advanced, that gap is going to destroy the learning potential. If I model things that are too easy for them, they're going to get bored. And so Vygotsky's idea is you can actually, if you can do those things I was saying, if you can get their attention, if you can accurately assess where they're at and then model the next step, and more specifically model the step to the next step. That's sort of the magic here. Because his underlying idea is you can perform better than your best in the right scenario. You should write that. That's a good way of saying it. I just freestyled that, but that you can do better than your best in the right scenario is basically ZPD. This idea that if you're in a situation where it's like a good learning. Okay, so say if you're 8 years old and you're learning how to read at a better level, and you're reading with, this is why schools do reading buddies, paired with someone a grade older, not like 6 grades older, because that gap's too big. So a grade older, so that when you get on the hard words that would slow you down, they help you with that. All of a sudden now you can read at almost like a higher level immediately. So this is this idea of this zone of proximal development. And if you can master this, if you can master understanding where people are at, where the next step is, and how to model how to get from the current situation to the next step, and then keep doing that, keep doing that, keep doing that, keep doing that, that's actually how to improve performance. You can use that in your own life. It's actually a very smart idea. Focus on where is that, what's the next step, and how to really understand and articulate that bridge. So for your notes, I would have this kind of thing, right? So his idea is, and now that if you kind of understood what I was saying on that last slide, this should make sense now that his idea is that our mind, our cognitive functions, scrap the word mind, our cognitive functions develop social-culturally, right? In this, like, not just socially, but also the very specific culture of our upbringing. And I mean culture in, like, I know how we kind of commonly use culture but I mean culture in the sense of like the culture of the learning environment, more specifically, okay? And the idea is that that learning environment is inseparable, right? That the development of mind is inseparable from that learning environment. So Vygotsky's basically doing a nurture side of the argument, and he's not denying the nature side, but he's saying like, okay, so of course people are bringing different makeup to the table, like different genetic makeup to the table, but at a certain point there's going to be differences in quality of environment. And you can kind of read into this. This is an argument for school and for certain kinds of better schools and for whatever, right? It's like if you can construct a better learning environment. That's why I made the comparison to martial arts before, and saying that this is actually also really important to understand if you're ever in the role of instructing in anything. This would be applicable to music. This would be applicable to theater, be applicable to canoeing and mountaineering and whatever sports or activities you're all into. It's the most important insight from psychology for coaching almost, is that catching attention, accurately assessing where they're at, modeling the next step, building that bridge and articulating it, rinse and repeat, right? That's performance development in a sentence, basically. So Vygotsky's having this idea that cognitive development is learning to use the inventions of society, language and memory strategies and mathematical systems, and that it's this engagement with your cultural, intellectual world. And the social interaction with more skilled adults and peers is indispensable to cognitive development, meaning you can't just take that out. And this is, again, an argument for school, that having like teachers that are focused on where the kid's at and trying to craft learning environments for them is like a best case scenario. And obviously different schools are better or worse. And if you're a next generation of teachers, like it's like this is maybe the most important slide in the course. Like the better you are at crafting these zones of proximal development, the better you will be at improving the performance of your students on academic, social, athletic, whatever thing you're doing.
Vygotsky's theory of social development argues that community and language play a central part in learning, while Jean Piaget concluded that children's cognitive development happens in stages. Vygotsky rejected his ideas and believed that children develop independently of specific stages as the result of social interactions. Vygotsky claimed that we are born with 4 elementary mental functions: attention, sensation, perception, and memory. It is our social and cultural environment that allows us to use these elementary skills to develop and finally gain higher mental functions. This development ideally happens in the zone of proximal development. First, there is what we can do on our own. Then, there is the zone of proximal development, which represents what we can do with the help of an adult, a friend, technology, or what Vygotsky called the more knowledgeable other. Last, there is what's beyond our reach. To illustrate this, let us think of twins who were raised in a community in which boys are expected to learn and succeed, while girls are only expected to be pretty. At the age of 10 months, both have the ability to crawl and are in the zone of proximal development for learning how to stand on their feet. The more knowledgeable other, in this case the father, provides the boy with opportunities to practice in a playroom that he has equipped with scaffolding and other objects. The boy is encouraged to explore the equipment, and eventually he uses it to pull himself up. A few hours later, he's cruising along the structures, and a few days later, he's standing on his feet. The girl also has the potential to stand, but does not receive any support in learning the skill. When we compare the two, we see that while the girl is still trying to get up, the boy has moved into a new zone. He knows how to balance while standing, and now has the potential to learn how to walk. Both will eventually learn how to walk, but according to Vygotsky, the boy will be more skilled. The same principles apply to all learning and the development of higher cognitive functions, and only those learning with the assistance of a capable mentor can reach the full potential of their ability. Vygotsky therefore believed that inside the zone of proximal development, learning can precede development, which means that a child is able to learn skills that go beyond their natural maturity. He also established an explicit connection between speech and mental concepts, arguing that inner speech develops from external speech via a gradual process of internalization. This means that thought itself develops as a result of conversation. Therefore, younger children who don't finish this process can only think out loud. Once the process is complete, inner speech and spoken language become independent. Lev Vygotsky died of tuberculosis in 1934 at the age of 37. Despite his young age, he became one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. He left the following advice for educators. By giving students practice in talking with others, we give them frames for thinking on their own. What do you think? Can a child learn anything regardless of any developmental prerequisites? And do we learn only through social and cultural contexts? And if so, do you think it is appropriate for a more knowledgeable other to determine what a child should learn next? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
If you like
So then I wanted to talk about this for a second, just throw this image up to make this point that then there started to become, historically, in like say 60s, 70s, 80s, the kind of computer revolution starts, this tendency to start to view the brain as being computer-like, or the mind or the brain is a computer, as a metaphor. And I'll give it that in some scenarios it's actually really helpful. So for example, when we're trying to understand something like memory and how you download a file and store a file in a folder and then retrieve it later and open the file, it's a decent metaphor for talking about how encoding and encoding, storage, and recall happens with our memory system. It's a useful metaphor. It's not, there's limits to the metaphor, right? But our mind is so dynamically interconnected that the computer metaphor really does fall apart in terms of a lot of other things, like especially, if we want to jump right to the hardest ones like consciousness. But again, that's all just me just kind of ranting. The usefulness of looking at mind as a computer comes, I think, mostly as an illustrative way of looking at memory. So now you can see in the language, right, like information processing theories, you could see that being the title of like a computer course, right? And the idea of looking at the brain as a computational system, which it sort of is, but it completely is actually, but it's this dynamic, organic, your brain is the most interesting thing in the known universe. But the idea here is that so if you could have this in your notes, and I'll just kind of rant around it for a bit. So the idea in information processing theory is looking at development not quite as much in the stage, like you go to here, then here, then here, like say Piaget, but looking at it how almost like a computer software uploading, which is sort of what Piaget was saying too. So it's like, in a kind of interesting way, it's almost just a different metaphor, but it's looking at this idea that how individuals manipulate information and monitor it and strategize about it, almost like they're doing these like computer calculations in their head, and that individuals gradually develop the capacity to process information, allowing them to acquire increasingly complex knowledge and skills. And that like the kids in this image, it's like you can almost see that they're like reading, and it's like then they're processing it and they're adding context and meaning from their own experience, and then they're thinking about it, and it's like information processing. So I'll kill my video for this one just so you can see the whole model I'm going to put up here. Bandura, someone I'm going to come back to. And if you could, you might even want to just draw it. You don't, obviously don't have to draw the kid and the Bobo doll in the middle, but just this is what's called reciprocal determinism, but you don't have to have that right now, but you can add that if you want. It's actually reciprocal, like back and forth. Reciprocal determinism is what this model is actually called. I'm not sure why I don't have that word on the slide. And his big idea, Bandura, is that there's you and how you're experiencing yourself. So that's the bottom left there, person and cognition, you and your thinking. And then there's your environment, and then your behavior is almost from a psychotheoretical perspective useful to view as a third aspect of that dynamic. That because we're also seeing ourselves behave, which is informing how we're seeing ourselves, others are seeing us behave, it's informing their understanding of us, we're watching other people. And he starts to make this argument that like this kind of social cognition argument that some of our learning is from, or he calls it social cognitive, yeah, that some of our learning is from seeing other people. And that how we make sense of that has a huge effect on things like behavior. And later we'll look at it, the classic Bobo doll experiments, where they actually, the idea was like, this is a time when people are starting to get the personal TVs in their house, and the argument that was kind of common at that day was, will exposure to violence and sexuality influence behavior of youth, right? And that's an argument in some ways that still exists today. Like, does playing Grand Theft Auto change the behavior of a kid? And that's actually a difficult question. And the answer is, well, it depends which kid, and it depends how they play it, and it depends who they play it with, and it depends their attitude and how they're perceiving and internalizing aspects of the game. It depends what game. And so it's actually a complicated question. And what his research was crystal clear. His research was he would send people in and have adults hit that clown bouncy thing, and then let kids in the room, and the kids would model the parents' behavior or the adult behavior. And almost every kid that saw, I think every single one actually, that saw the adult violently interact with the doll would do so. And ones that didn't see that would sometimes like try to comb its hair, put hats on it, or respond differently. So the idea in that study was like, could you basically prime aggression? Could I show you something that made you later more likely to be aggressive? Because that's sort of the argument against like video games or whatever. So we'll get back to Bandura, but it's important to kind of historically give him the little shout out that he deserves at this kind of as a cognitive theorist. So the next thing, and we'll touch on this a bit, like the etiological perspective, or just this idea of how animal studies and understanding animal behavior and understanding them in their natural habitat can be helpful in understanding certain things about humanity. This idea that stress is the behavior strongly influenced by biology tied to evolution. Like, we could look at things like the stress response, the reaction, the way that our food processes, our body processes things like sugar, how sleep cycles work, different biorhythms. and how things like, say, for example, pregnancy are characterized by critical or sensitive periods, and how this, meaning that like some points in a pregnancy are, for example, more dangerous for a woman to drink than other parts. Why is that? What's the underlying biology of that? Why would that be similar for other mammals? How is understanding, and just look at how so much of the early studies in psychology are, and even nowadays, are looking at things like mice. And why mice? Well, because mice are a somewhat simple mammal that still have a cardiovascular and a central nervous system that are somewhat comparable, so the effects that things have on them would be informative of how it would affect us. It's actually pretty fascinating. Specific time frames during which the presence or absence of certain experiences have long-lasting influences on individuals. You look at things like how a baby duck, if it doesn't prime and link to an imprint on the mom right away in the first few days, or interestingly, it could imprint on a different kind of bird species or even a human, it will never form that mom-baby relationship. It almost loses that ability to do so. So that'd be big time considered like a critical period. If you're wondering for your notes the difference between critical and sensitive periods in terms of from an evolutionary and development perspective, like the example I used of dangerousness of drinking during pregnancy, is just like amount of time. A critical period is a shorter amount of time. And the specifics is going to just depend on what we're talking about. Okay, we're almost there. Just a couple more things I want to talk about. I want to talk about Bronfenbrenner. Just a nice, really easy model to finish with. That model actually is easier than it looks. It looks super complicated, but it's basically just saying that to understand your life, you have to look at you, and then the people that are kind of most immediate in your circle, and then kind of your broader community, and then sort of like the culture that you're in and the media and everything like that, and then sort of this like larger culture. So it's basically just saying, if your social world, if we were trying to draw it out and actually get a more complex answer to what is the environment in which you live socially and culturally, he's saying that it can be helpful to break it into this 5 systems, or these 5 layers. So this is kind of interesting, and I think the best way to kind of make sense of all of what I'm saying about Bronfenbrenner's model is to keep in mind this is sort of like someone making a nurture debate to a certain degree, right? Like they're saying like the nature debate is in the orange circle. That's like you. That's whatever you're bringing to the table genetically and all of that kind of stuff. But that person exists within this microsystem, this like setting in which the individual lives, and I guess it also in his definition includes their genetic makeup, so the individual is within that. Right, and so it's like your microsystem at the lowest level, sort of. It's like you and the people most immediate to your life. It's your most direct interactions. And his idea is you're somewhat born into this, and that's what he means by like sort of a passive recipient of experiences, but also actively involved in constructing that environment. Again, I'm not going to like quiz you super hard on this, but I just want you to have this idea of sort of microsystem as your most immediate social group. So then, this is a kind of tough idea, but it's what he's basically saying with the mesosystem, or the in-between systems. You see that there in the blue, right? There's like you and everyone around you, but then everyone around you is also in relationship with everyone else, and so there's this like mesosystem, this relationship between the microsystems, or connections between contexts. That you go to school with some of these people, and then your parents become friends with their parents, and then it's basically like what we consider like community, but almost he's trying to talk about the kind of systemic dynamics behind something we would call community, if we're looking at it as a pattern of intentional interactions, basically. Again, we're not going to spend tons of time in this course on Bronfenbrenner's model, but it is important. What he is trying to kind of say is like, to understand the human, you have to understand the system. So you can see how this is a system theory. The system that human lives in. This model is actually pretty informative. So then, to finish this up, he's saying, okay, so then there's you, there's all of your immediate connections, there's a relationship between all those people, then there's this kind of broader layer around that, and that's kind of like all the other things in your culture and in your town and village or whatever. It's like all the other friends and family, the media you're exposed to. So this is kind of even broader influences, the kind of government and all that kind of stuff, and legal situation and your neighbors and all that kind of stuff. And then all of that exists within this larger macro system of like kind of the cultural values and or maybe religious values or maybe political values of your time. And so again, all he's saying is you're this person surrounded by this circle of people who are all in relationship to, and then that's existing within this broader community that you're closer and less close with different people, and also that also includes like all the stuff that all of you are being exposed to in terms of media and interaction with government and interaction with school systems and all that kind of stuff, and then that exists within your culture. So then you can see at the bottom this idea of the chronos system, and earlier in this course earlier in this presentation I talked about the chronos as being like the Roman deity of time, god of time. So chronos is associated with this idea of time, and it's basically just a saying like all those things I just said. So you're this person with this social group around you, and they're all in relationship, meso, and then exo is like your broader community, and then macro is like the culture in which you live, and then chrono system means like all that's the case, and you're living in a very specific time period that's having its own unique influence on you. That's why I put obviously the coronavirus there. It's like that's affecting our experience of right now too, uniquely. It's part of our chrono system. So let me just use Maslow quick to sort of give a shout out to the growth psychologist, and then we'll touch on different people as we go through the course. If you deliberately plan on being less than you're capable of being, then I warn that you'll be unhappy for the rest of your life. Maslow really thought this driving for self-realization was, and his term was actually, self-actualization, is that to actually become who you as a true self are capable of becoming is actually like the ultimate human pursuit and motivational goal. And this underlies this whole approach to growth psychology that, you know, his upcoming, I'm going to show obviously like the triangle hierarchy of needs, but it's actually and I know you've seen it before, but I'm going to try to touch on why I would show it again. I know you've seen it, but it is a key idea that actually people need things like belonging and love and social connection. And it's hard to get to things like self-actualization and self-esteem if you don't have those things. So with Maslow and Rogers here, in this hierarchy of needs, you might see in a triangle that's like a little bit different, and it always has like physiological needs and then safety needs and belonging and esteem and self-actualization. And this one sort of breaks the growth needs. This is like a later model into also like aesthetic and cognitive needs. And basically the point I want to make here though, and we'll break down Maslow a bit and throughout this course much more, but this idea that like unless if someone's worrying about their next meal, it's really hard to work on self-actualization. If someone doesn't feel safe and they feel under threat, it's hard to work on things like esteem. And then if someone doesn't feel like they belong, it's hard to self-actualize too. And that belonging can mean all kinds of different things, but that these aren't things that would be nice. These are actually developmental needs. And that this came as a reaction to some of the behavioral science that was or behavioral psychology that was in flavor of the day. And so Maslow you've seen with this, and then Rogers has articulated it somewhat differently in saying like the goal in life is to become what he called a fully functioning person, or similar to the idea of self-actualized. But if you could be the best version of yourself and be fully functioning as in your relationships, in your work, in your writing, in your internal dialogue. And it's based on this idea that humans can be traumatized and can get into bad patterns of behavior, but at their best, and when they're released from some of those patterns, that the average person is going to want to try to do better, and almost you can foster this growth potential. And that's why sometimes in the broader, now it might be interesting for you to know that this time period wise kind of coincides with like what you could broader call kind of the hippie movement and this whole idea of self-discovery. And yeah, so it's like same time period, which is kind of interesting. So instead of breaking down each of the levels, which I'm sure you probably already know and have already heard, maybe multiple teachers do, I want to kind of hit this from the side and say basically what his idea is that your body experiences unease when it doesn't feel homeostasis. And if you remember that word from like high school biology, homeostasis means like for example, when you get hot, so your body starts to sweat to bring you back to like a normalized temperature and to re-achieve homeostasis, that your body's monitoring and alerting us to these basic needs, so especially the physiological ones and the safety needs, and even things like the need to reproduce. So there's a little Freudian aspect there. So this idea that physiological needs are fundamental to our survival and our body innately tries to balance that, right? Our body will, especially with things like, say, for example, sleep, the need to eat, the need to breathe, the need to go to the bathroom. All those things are things that our body is attempting to constantly achieve some level of balance over, and it's why it's stressful when you're tired and hungry and need to go to the bathroom and thirsty. It's sort of what hunger and thirst and the urge to go to the bathroom and tiredness are. I think an important way to look at this model is to kind of look at the hierarchy of needs triangle as sort of broken into two sections. And the idea is there's certain ones that if you're experiencing deficiency in, or not enough of deficiency, it's overwhelming to the system, and it makes reaching these higher, what he calls being needs, like being a human being, like that use of the word, those kind of needs. So the idea here is if things like your physiological needs and your safety needs and your needs for belonging and love and esteem aren't met, Maslow taught that that's like highly associated with things like anxiety and depression. And you see even there, it's like you can see kind of with that triangle, and you see the orange line going down and saying like people can regress to lower needs if they're not met. Right? Like it's like you don't have to be in your moment of self-realization and actualization for very long. You don't have to be without water or air for very long before reality pulls you back. And that can be something more negative too, like feeling not safe. And the second part of that is that these being needs, or these higher order esteem needs, are important to feeling self-actualization. But the kind of core point I'm trying to make is you're not going to get to any of those if the bottom of the pyramid isn't taken care of. The base of the pyramid is what allows for progression to these higher needs. And that's kind of one of Maslow's core ideas. That if we're trying to raise successful children and stuff, we need to really focus on those bottom four. And then that puts them in a position to experience these higher levels of realization of who they are, or self-actualization. I'm just going to touch on this here, but I will use this opportunity to just say to anyone that's interested, and if you've been liking this presentation, I'm actually teaching a 4th-year course on positive psychology starting in the winter at Nipissing. I think it's cross-listed as CHSF and CHFS, 4306. I think it's also Psych 4306. And I'm going to be really focusing on positive psychology, and if you don't meet the prerequisites, you could just email me and I can waive that. And if any of you are interested, I'd love to have you in the course, but I'm not trying to push it. I think it's already got enough to go. But if you're interested in this idea, I am going to do a whole seniors, we used to call it at Waterloo seniors honors essays or classes, but here I think that at Nipissing they call them special topics classes. And because positive psychology is also this kind of more recent trend of this idea that psychology is not just about helping people that are experiencing low mood and stuff come back up to what we consider kind of average or baseline. It's also about exploring the higher realms of human experience and the higher realms of positive emotion and engagement with others and with intellectually challenging tasks, and this idea of that we can actually construct and cultivate and maintain and foster positive growth promoting relationships with people and learn how to live lives of deep meaning and purpose, and actually also experience this idea of understanding properly how to set goals and make long-term visions and realize those, and the psychotherapeutic aspect that has, or effect that has on us. And so this gets, that whole rant I did was sort of trying to encapsulate this PERMA model, or this core idea in positive psychology of this new theory of well-being, that actually you can use ideas from psychology to not just heal, but to, you know, reach towards what Maslow would have called self-actualization, or what Frankl would call self-transcendence, or what Rogers would call becoming a fully actualized or a fully functioning person. That we can actually be strategic about building it in. Well, you want to do that? Well, let's work on building more positive emotion and not fake. I'm not saying be fake. I'm not saying, you know, laugh at things that are painful. What I'm saying is learning to understand that in a life that's difficult, having an optimistic core that's unshakable is a psychological defense, and it might actually pull you through situations. And the harder the situation, the more important it is not to lose hope. Because in some situations that might be all you have, and that's Viktor Frankl right there. And if you can maintain that hope, the ability of hope to pull human beings through situations is as well documented of an event as there is in human history. That actually being psychologically engaged and fascinated in things. I've made this point to students before, that I think like fascination is the exact opposite of, you know, so many of the negative mental spaces we get into. That there's something amazing about being really curious and engaged and into something new and finding something intellectually stimulating. It's therapeutic. That we can have relationships with people and in groups, and we can influence each other in incredibly positive and negative ways. And that if we understand that, and we actually try to intentionally foster situations and cultivate situations where we can have meaningful roles in each other's lives, that, you know, these are all ways to increase this, well, these are all this new theory of well-being. That if we can learn that humans need meaning and purpose, and it's an important orientational and directional motivation and goal for human beings. And if we can actually create situations where people can experience meaningful engagement with other people and with topics and with things like religion or spirituality or volunteering or creativity or their hobbies or sports or helping other people, or all kinds of different things, and that we can actually help people build these into their lives, and this idea of more practical goal making for very specific reason of improving your life step by step in these incremental but significant steps. So this is the PERMA, or the positive psychology, and this is Dr. Martin Seligman, who we'll talk about more in the course. Seligman's like Seilgman. So Thielen, and this idea of, I wanted to add this too, because this is a little bit newer, but it's actually really interesting that this is almost a physical look at this, and this idea that our learning is connected to our physical experience specifically, and that you're going through your life and experiencing things, and it's not just your brain experiencing things, that your nervous system, your body, your whole kind of embodied, meaning like your whole lived self or whatever, is going through this world trying to make sense of it. And part of that fact that we're able to respond in different situations and be adaptive and flexible, and why humans are so amazing at that, some of that has to do with the brain, but some of that has to do with our highly developed central nervous system, and how, even getting into, you know, debate of what the relationship between the central nervous system and the brain, and the brain is filled with neurons, which are nerve cells basically, so it's like the difference between the two is interesting, and this kind of theory is really looking at this idea that so much of how you experience things is because you're a physical being moving through a physical reality, and we can't drop that piece and think of ourselves as just like psychological, thought-based people living in a world of ideas. It's like, well, you are that, but there's also this physical reality. He talks about this idea of like phase transitions, where it's like we go from not being able to move to being able to move, from not being able to speak to being able to speak. And these huge points where there's like this like babbling, say for example with speech, there's just like babbling, awkward, inability to do it, and then they can. Where these points of instability and turbulence lead to these new levels of complexity. So it's a kind of complex theory, and you don't need to know too much about that right now. If you just sort of have the two purple points would be kind of the key parts. And then just this idea of like the human being as a lived experience is sort of an interesting thought. Is that you're not just your mind, you might be going through something stressful and the thoughts might be stressful, but your nervous system's also experiencing that as stress, and that's part of shaping your emotions and how you're responding and how you're physically behaving. Okay, I'm going to try to fire through these, okay? This is going to be my lightning round, where I'm just going to go over all the main points quick, okay? Development is the pattern of change that begins at conception and continues through the lifespan and includes both growth and decline. Development is constructed through biological, social, cultural, and individual factors working together. There's some complex interplay of those things. That we've seen dramatic increases in life expectancy, and this peaked increase in development during the later adulthood, like this increased interest now in the psychological experience of seniors, for example. That these three key developmental processes we're going to be looking at this course, biological, cognitive, and social emotional, and that our development as humans is influenced by the complicated interplay of these three things. Okay, so number 5, the lifespan is commonly divided into these different periods: prenatal, infancy, early childhood, middle and late childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood. We often think of age only in chronological terms, but a full evaluation of age requires considering things like biological age and psychological age and social age. That we looked at these three pathways of aging: pathological, normal, and successful. In research covering adolescence through late adulthood, many but not all studies find that older adults report the highest level of happiness. And this is kind of interesting. I don't think we actually touched on this directly, but this idea that life satisfaction tends to improve with life. And it's like once we get out of especially this 20 and 30 year, our 20s and 30s, where we're really focused on developing career and forming relationships and stuff, and if we can do that well, it tends to be associated with high levels of life satisfaction later. And that's why these like 20s and 30s are so key to development. There's 3 important issues in the study of development that are nature and nurture, this idea of continuity and discontinuity, or why some things continue and some things discontinue, and then the idea of stability and change, or why some things behaviors change and some continue. According to the psychoanalytic theories, including those of Freud and Erikson, development primarily depends on the unconscious mind and is heavily couched or heavily embedded in emotion and emotional energy. Okay, 2 more slides and then a quick video, and then we're done. Cognitive theories emphasize thinking, reasoning, language, and other cognitive processes. And the main cognitive theorists that we're going to look at in this course are Piaget and Vygotsky, and then some of the people coming out of the information processing kind of branch. Behavioral and social cognitive theories emphasize the environment's role in development. 2 major people in that are Skinner and then Bandura. We talked about Lorenz's, I don't know if I gave you his last name, but Lorenz's ethological theory that looks at this kind of biological and evolutionary base of development and how it links with other mammal species. Okay, according to Bronfenbreimer's bioecological model, so that your biological system within an ecological environment, development predominantly reflects the influence of these 5 systems. We looked at the microsystem, the mesosystem, ecosystem, macrosystem, and chronosystem. According to the humanist perspective, so this is going to be Maslow, Rogers, individuals are motivated towards self-improvement, and if you can craft situations for them where that can express itself, they'll be able to reach these higher levels of development. An eclectic orientation incorporates the best features of different theoretical approaches. So that's the final point. I didn't actually say that in the presentation, but that's a good point, that like modern psychology is going to sort of, I guess I sort of talked about this, is going to use what works in different situations, right? So a lot of behavioral techniques are used when we're working with things like depression, but also cognitive techniques when we're looking at things like how the thought patterns and the negative thought triads and stuff associated with depression. Whereas if we're looking at how trust develops in an infant, Erickson's model is really helpful. So we'll kind of use what makes sense. Okay, so we're done the presentation. I just have a short little kind of hopefully motivational video, and then just my kind of thanks for watching slide. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. It wasn't too bad. We're going to finish up, it looks like, right about 3 hours. So yeah, I hope this was okay and kind of as good as, I'm not really sure how your other teachers are doing this remotely, but I think some of your classes are in person. But anyways, I hope this video was okay and you got a few things from it. Cheers and take care.
You are here, somewhere. You can't see you, it's too far away, but you're here somewhere. Maybe here, maybe here. You could be almost anywhere here, but you're definitely here. You don't know why or for what. No one does. All you know, all I know, is that you are somewhere here, magnetized to this strange, lushly coated wet rock, floating in its designated position of endless nothing. This rock you are on, it's tiny, and you are tiny compared to this rock. If we zoom out a little bit, look how tiny you are. Even further, tinier. You're so tiny, your even tinier brain can't comprehend how tiny you are. Your tiny self is posted up on this tiny rock surrounded by this dark, massive, unending space that could be anything and nothing at the same time. This rock will give you life. It will give you everything you need to live on its crust for a period of time. It might feel like a while, or it might feel like no time at all, depending on what mood you're in when you consider this idea. Regardless of how it feels to you, when compared to almost everything else, it will be so short. A single frame in a movie that never ends. A frame that could be removed and nothing would really change about the movie. In this frame, you will live on this rock, then you will die, and you will have no idea what happened. No one will. If you're really lucky, you'll have some friends and family and lovers who will be sad for a little while. They'll miss you, but they'll try really hard not to, because being sad and missing someone all the time is really tiresome. It'll mess up their lives, so they'll try to work through it and move on as best they can. They might go to therapy, they might practice techniques to get through grieving. They'll probably be somewhat successful. They will also die. If you're even more unusually lucky, you'll be missed and remembered for a little bit longer by a few more people. Perhaps you did something that impacted more people while you lived on this rock. Perhaps you were profoundly artistic, or smart, or a leader, or an inventor. When you die, perhaps more people will be sad for a little longer stretch of time. Most of these people would have never really known you though, so they won't think about you too much for too long either. And when they do, it'll mostly be a misconstruction of you based on their own ideals. They will all die. Over time, every person and every memory of a person will all die with each other. This won't matter. To you, to me, to anyone, we'll all be dead. The things you did, the words you said, the impacts you made, for good or for bad, big or small, they will all lose your name tag and will not matter to anyone or anything. So, whatever you're nervous about right now, whoever you're nervous because of, perhaps a first date, a job interview, a big presentation, an important test, a hard conversation, you might feel paralyzed with anxiety. You might feel like the course of your life is hinged on this coming moment, that the fate of reality is on your shoulders. It's not. You might be worried that you're going to do the wrong thing or fail. You might, but everything will be okay. Because for some reason, against all conceivable odds, you're on this weird rock, this planet that births life, life that births more life, novel life, intelligent life, you. In this unknowable vacuum of potential nihility, you have this playground, this consciousness, this capacity for wonder, emotion, and thought. The only real mistake you can make is to not recognize this, to never relax and enjoy the hilarious and enthralling absurdity of it all, to realize that it all means nothing beyond itself, and to find freedom and inspiration in this thought, to explore and connect with what it can mean to be a you on a rock, in a solar system, in a galaxy, in a universe, in a who knows what, to be kind and decent, to have fun, to love, to laugh, to cry, to try, to fail, to live, and to remember that no matter whatever happens, you can still do all of this. No matter what you do in life, Worst case is you try your best, you be yourself, and you do what you can do with compassion, honesty, effort, and understanding. And it goes worst case. And then you move on, like everything else.
Thank you for watching. If you found enjoyment and value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are not already, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We are constantly coming out with new videos to help you experience life with clarity and wonder.
So thanks for watching. See you next time. Same bat time, same bat channel, although it might not be the same time. I'll try to get it out a little bit earlier. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Biological Beginnings will be the next one. We'll do chapter 2. Alright, cheers. Take care.